I am Cassidy, 35 years old, and for the last half-decade my family has proudly introduced me to every neighbor and distant relative as their absolute greatest disappointment. The dropout, the black sheep, the lost cause. But as I stood in the grand marble foyer of my parents' opulent suburban home this Thanksgiving, forcing a polite smile, while my mother publicly humiliated me over a bottle of wine, I felt a deep and calming sense of peace. I did not argue. I did not defend myself, because I knew something they did not. In exactly 3 hours, a breaking financial news alert would simultaneously hit every smartphone in that dining room, revealing the 9-figure tech empire I had been building in total secrecy. And the golden child brother they worshipped was about to unwittingly hand me the ultimate victory. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to smile through disrespect while secretly holding the winning hand. Growing up in the affluent neighborhoods of the Chicago suburbs meant that appearances were the only currency that truly mattered. Our sprawling brick colonial home, complete with perfectly manicured hedges and a circular driveway, was essentially a stage for my parents to perform their success. Inside those walls, affection was conditional, and love was entirely dependent on what you could put on a corporate resume. 5 years ago, when I chose to walk away from my final year at a prestigious law school to build a tech startup, my parents practically held a funeral for my reputation. I went from being their promising daughter to a cautionary tale overnight. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and expensive sage when I stepped through the heavy oak front door that afternoon. I carried my coat over one arm and held a beautifully wrapped bottle of Reserve Pinot Noir in the other hand. I had spent $150 on that bottle. It was a quiet peace offering a subtle way to show them that I was not the destitute failure they constantly imagined me to be. My mother Brenda practically glided into the foyer to intercept me. She wore a tailored cashmere dress and a string of pearls, her smile perfectly practiced and completely devoid of warmth. She did not hug me. Instead, her eyes immediately darted to the bottle in my hand. "Oh, sweetie, you really should not have spent your rent money on this," she said, her voice dripping with that familiar manufactured pity. Before I could even form a response, she turned and unceremoniously shoved the expensive bottle into the hands of Maria, their longtime housekeeper, who was passing through the hall with a tray of appetizers. "Maria, just take this straight to the kitchen," my mother instructed without breaking eye contact with me. "We will use it for cooking the roast or maybe a stew next week. Jason brought the camas, so we will obviously be serving that for dinner." I watched Maria give me a sympathetic wince before scurrying away. The familiar knot of tension tightened in my stomach. The camas. Of course. My older brother Jason could bring tap water in a plastic jug, and my mother would probably pour it into crystal goblets and call it vintage. But I just took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of my silk blouse. "I am doing just fine on rent, Mom," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. The wine was meant to pair with the dinner. My mother sighed loudly, a dramatic exhale designed to let me know how exhausting she found my very existence. Her gaze slowly dragged up and down my outfit. I was wearing a sharp tailored blazer, dark slacks, and a high-quality silk top. It was professional, understated, and comfortable. But to her, because it did not come with a corporate title she could brag about at the country club, it was basically rags. "Well, I just wish you would dress for the job you want, Cassidy," she said, reaching out to pick a microscopic piece of lint off my shoulder. "Not the part-time gig you currently have. You are 35 years old. It is time to start taking your presentation seriously. If you ever want to get out of doing basic customer service on the internet, you need to look the part of a professional." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. A part-time gig. Basic customer service on the internet. That was how she chose to understand my life. When I dropped out of law school, I realized that the entire corporate legal industry was drowning in outdated compliance paperwork. So I taught myself advanced coding algorithms and built a stealth legal tech platform that automated corporate compliance for top-tier law firms. I had spent 5 years working 18-hour days in total obscurity, building a company from my laptop that was now revolutionizing the industry. I was not doing customer service. I was running a company that was quietly being courted by every major venture capital firm on the East Coast. But I had never corrected her. Every time I had tried to explain my business in the early days, my parents had dismissed it as a delusional hobby. My father, Thomas, had even told me to stop playing on computers and get a real job as a paralegal. So I simply stopped sharing. I let them believe whatever narrative made them feel superior. Let them think I was barely scraping by. It made the silence so much sweeter. Are your sister and DeAndre here yet? I asked, deliberately changing the subject before she could start asking me if I wanted her to pay for my health insurance again. Natalie and her husband are in the living room, my mother said, waving her hand dismissively. DeAndre is talking about the hospital again. I swear the man is a saint for doing nursing work, but nobody wants to hear about bedpans during the holidays. Go keep them company. I need to make sure the dining room is perfect before the important guests arrive. Important guests. That meant Jason was bringing someone from his firm. Jason was a senior associate at a massive corporate law firm entirely obsessed with making partner. He collected powerful people like trophies, and he never missed an opportunity to flaunt them in front of the family to solidify his status as the golden child. I braced myself. A holiday dinner with Jason was bad enough. A holiday dinner with Jason performing for an audience was a completely different level of psychological warfare. I walked past the grand staircase, ignoring the massive family portraits that lined the wall. I noticed immediately that the most recent portrait taken last Christmas had me positioned at the very edge of the frame, half obscured by a decorative fern, while Jason stood dead center, with my parents beaming up at him. The visual metaphor was so heavy-handed, it was almost comical. Just as I reached the archway of the living room, ready to greet my younger sister, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the house. The doorbell chimed loudly right after. "Oh, they are here!" My mother practically shrieked from the kitchen, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor as she rushed back to the foyer. "Cassidy, stay out of the way for a moment." I paused by the archway, turning to look back toward the entrance. My mother flung the door open with a radiant, entirely different smile than the one she had given me 10 minutes prior. Standing on the porch was Jason. He looked exactly the same as always, wearing a smug grin and a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than most people made in a month. But my mother was not looking at him. She was looking at the older, distinguished man standing next to him, wearing a cashmere overcoat and carrying an expensive leather briefcase. "Mr. Harrington," my mother fawned, stepping aside to let them in. "Welcome to our home. Jason has told us so much about you." I froze. I recognized that name immediately. Richard Harrington. He was the managing partner of the exact corporate law firm that Jason worked for. But more importantly, Richard Harrington was the man who just 48 hours ago had signed a legally binding agreement to acquire my stealth tech startup for $120 million. And as Jason swaggered into the house with his boss laughing loudly and taking off his coat, I realized with absolute certainty that neither of them had any idea that the anonymous founder they just paid millions to acquire was currently standing in the hallway, being treated like the hired help. My father, Thomas, practically materialized from the living room the moment he heard the heavy front door click shut. He adjusted his silk tie, his face instantly transforming into a mask of eager reverence. He wore the exact deferential smile he usually reserved for bank managers and country club presidents. "Richard, it is an absolute honor to finally have you in our home," my father boomed, stepping forward to vigorously shake the older man's hand. "Jason has told us so much about the incredible work you are doing at the firm." "The pleasure is mine, Thomas," Richard Harrington replied smoothly. His voice carried that distinct, practiced cadence of a man who billed thousands of dollars an hour. "Your son is a rising star. We are expecting big things from him this quarter. Jason puffed out his chest, looking like he had just won an Olympic gold medal. He shot a smug glance in my direction, making sure I heard the compliment. Let me introduce the rest of the clan. My father continued gesturing grandly as my sister Natalie and her husband DeAndre walked into the foyer. This is my youngest daughter Natalie and her husband DeAndre. He is a pediatric nurse over at the county hospital. My father said the word nurse with a slight hesitation, as if he were apologizing for DeAndre not being a neurosurgeon. But Richard offered a polite nod, shaking their hands. And of course my father said, his voice dropping a full octave, as his gaze finally landed on me. The warmth completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by a tight, strained expression. This is our middle child, Cassidy. She was at Columbia Law a few years ago, but she decided the academic rigor was just a bit too much for her. She is taking some time to figure herself out, doing some freelance computer work right now. I stood perfectly still. I did not flinch. I was so used to this rehearsed introduction that I could have recited it along with him. It was always the same narrative. Frame my departure from the Ivy League as a failure of intellect rather than a calculated business decision. Diminish my 5 years of relentless entrepreneurial grind into freelance computer work. Richard Harrington gave me a brief, dismissive smile. He looked at me the way a person looks at a piece of uninteresting furniture. "Nice to meet you, Cassidy," he murmured, already turning his attention back to Jason. It was in that exact moment of absolute dismissal that Jason decided to assert his dominance. He stepped forward, reaching into his tailored trouser pocket. "Hey, Cass!" Jason said, his voice loud enough to ensure the entire room was watching. "The driveway is completely packed with the caterer's vans and Mom's SUV. Do me a huge favor." Without warning, Jason underhanded a set of heavy car keys directly at my chest. "Take Richard's Lexus and park it down on Elm Street for us," Jason instructed, flashing a patronizing grin. "Try not to scratch the rims. It is an expensive machine." A heavy silence fell over the foyer. Natalie looked down at her shoes, clearly uncomfortable. DeAndre shifted his weight, his jaw tightening as he prepared to say something. But before DeAndre could intervene and start a fight, my mother chimed in. "Yes, please be careful with it, Cassidy," my mother added with a light chuckle. "It is not one of those little rented economy cars you are used to driving. They were treating me like a valet." In front of the man who had just authorized a 9-figure wire transfer to my holding company, I looked at the silver key fob resting in the palm of my hand. The leather tag bore the embossed logo of Richard's law firm. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I did not feel humiliated. I felt an exhilarating rush of anticipation. "No problem at all," I said, my voice completely devoid of sarcasm. "I would be happy to park it for you, Mr. Harrington." Richard barely nodded in my direction, already shrugging off his coat, as my father ushered him toward the formal living room to pour him a scotch. Jason trailed right behind them, like a desperate puppy. I turned around, ignoring the sympathetic look DeAndre gave me, and walked back out the front door into the crisp November evening. The air was cold and sharp. I walked down the expansive driveway until I reached the street where Richard's pristine black Lexus sedan was idling perfectly at the curb. I slid into the driver's seat. The interior smelled of rich mahogany and expensive leather. I adjusted the mirror, put the car in drive, and began steering it down the quiet, tree-lined suburban block. As I pulled up to the curb a block away, I shifted the car into park and let the engine idle for a moment. I glanced over at the passenger seat. Resting right in the center of the beige leather was a thick manila folder. It was sealed with a red tab, but the cover page was clearly visible. Printed in bold black ink across the top was the letterhead of Richard's elite law firm. And right beneath it were the words, "Project Aegis Acquisition, Final Diligence Report, Strictly Confidential." I stared at the folder, letting out a soft, breathy laugh that filled the quiet cabin of the car. Aegis. That was the internal code name I had given my software platform on the day I incorporated the company in my tiny, unheated studio apartment 5 years ago. For the past 3 months, Richard Harrington and his army of high-paid corporate lawyers had been desperately tearing through my company's financials, algorithms, and compliance records, trying to figure out if my automated legal tech was truly as revolutionary as the venture capitalists claimed it was. They had combed through every single line of code. They had scrutinized my profit margins. They had aggressively negotiated the buyout price up to $120 million. But because my lead broker had instituted a strict blind trust protocol during the negotiations, Richard's firm had never once interacted with me directly. They only knew the founder as C. Davis, a brilliant reclusive tech genius who was about to modernize their entire firm. And the man who had just spearheaded that massive acquisition for his firm had just handed the architect of his future the keys to his car and told her not to scratch the rims. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated the dark car. I opened my encrypted email app and checked the latest message from my lead broker in New York. The subject line read, SEC filing complete. Funds secured. I opened the email. The message was short and to the point. The final signatures were verified. The wire transfer had officially hit my holding account. The press release embargo was scheduled to lift exactly at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. The financial news networks already had the story loaded and ready to publish. I checked the digital clock on the dashboard of the Lexus. It was 6:30 in the evening. I had exactly 90 minutes left to endure their condescension. 90 minutes of listening to my father praise Jason, 90 minutes of my mother criticizing my life choices, 90 minutes of playing the pathetic failed dropout. I turned off the engine, grabbed the keys, and stepped out into the freezing air. I locked the doors with a sharp beep and began the short walk back to the brightly lit colonial house. My heart was beating in a steady, powerful rhythm. The trap was perfectly set, and all I had to do now was take my seat at the dining table and wait for the clock to strike 8. When I stepped back into the suffocating warmth of the house, the dining room was already a flurry of coordinated movement. My mother was directing Maria with sharp hand gestures, ensuring every crystal water glass and silver fork was perfectly aligned. The long mahogany table was a monument to excess, draped in imported linen and anchored by a massive floral centerpiece that completely obstructed my view of my father. I took my assigned seat at the far end of the table, safely tucked away next to my brother-in-law DeAndre, while Jason proudly took the chair immediately to the right of Richard Harrington. It was the seat of honor deliberately positioned, so Jason could spend the entire meal whispering directly into his boss's ear. As the first course was served, a delicate butternut squash soup that my mother made sure to announce took 2 days to prepare. Jason immediately seized control of the conversation. He was not just talking, he was performing. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his expensive wine, and began broadcasting his supposed brilliance to the entire room. Richard and I have been buried in the trenches on a massive acquisition this quarter, Jason announced, projecting his voice so everyone would stop eating and look at him. It is a completely revolutionary tech integration for the firm. We are buying out an artificial intelligence platform that handles corporate compliance. It is highly confidential, of course, but let us just say the legal parameters I have been drafting for the transition are going to change the way the entire industry operates. My father beamed, practically vibrating with pride. That sounds incredibly complex, Jason. You must be working around the clock. It takes a certain kind of analytical mind, Jason agreed, feigning a humble sigh. The core algorithm is a beast. I have spent the last month practically rewriting their compliance protocols, just to make sure the software does not violate state privacy laws when we plug it into our servers. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my soup. The urge to spit it out in a fit of hysterical laughter was almost entirely overwhelming. Jason was lying through his perfectly veneered teeth. The compliance protocols of the Aegis platform were completely locked behind end-to-end encryption. No one at his firm, not even Richard Harrington, had the administrative clearance to rewrite a single line of my code. Jason was simply reviewing the external user manuals and trying to pass it off as high-level legal engineering. Jason noticed me quietly eating. and decided I was the perfect prop for his performance. He leaned across the table, pointing his silver spoon at me, like a teacher addressing a slow student. "I know this is probably flying right over your head, Cass," Jason said, offering a condescending smile. "Let me break it down for you. Think of this software like a very fast librarian. I know you struggled with the heavy reading back when you were briefly at Columbia, but this program basically reads the law for us and flags the errors. It is a very complicated digital filing cabinet. Do you understand?" He was comparing a predictive neural network capable of cross-referencing decades of international corporate case law in 3 seconds to a digital filing cabinet. I looked up from my bowl, meeting his arrogant stare. "A fast librarian," I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "That sounds like a very thorough way to describe an algorithmic parsing model." Jason chuckled, looking over at Richard to make sure his boss was witnessing how gracefully he handled his less intelligent sibling. "Exactly. It is all about data processing. You just have to know how to speak the language of the machine." I noticed DeAndre shift uncomfortably in his chair next to me. DeAndre was incredibly perceptive. He worked 12-hour shifts in a chaotic pediatric ward, dealing with life-and-death situations daily, which gave him an extremely low tolerance for my family's fabricated drama. He saw the subtle tightening of my jaw and immediately decided to intervene, throwing himself onto the conversational grenade. "Speaking of speaking the language," DeAndre said loudly, cutting Jason off before he could launch into another monologue. "We should really be toasting to Cassidy tonight. Natalie and I drove past your new place in Oak Park yesterday, Cass. That house is absolutely stunning. Closing on a 4-bedroom property in that neighborhood in this economy is a massive accomplishment. Congratulations." I shot DeAndre a grateful look. It was a genuine milestone. I had paid for the beautiful historic craftsman home entirely in cash 2 weeks ago, using a tiny fraction of my company's operating revenue. But in my family, any praise directed at me was treated as a direct threat to Jason's supremacy. My mother dropped her spoon, the silver clinking sharply against her china bowl. The warm, proud smile she had been giving Jason vanished instantly. "Oh, please, DeAndre, do not remind me." My mother sighed, pressing her fingers to her temples as if the very thought of my new home gave her a migraine. "I am still absolutely sick with worry over that mortgage." "Mom, it is a great house," Natalie finally spoke up, her voice quiet and hesitant. "It has a beautiful yard." "That is exactly the problem, Natalie." My father interjected, his tone stern and deeply disapproving. "Maintenance on a property like that is astronomical. Cassidy, you did not use one of those predatory subprime lenders, did you? Because I am telling you right now, your mother and I are preparing for retirement. When the bank forecloses on that place because your little freelance projects dry up, we will not be bailing you out. You are completely on your own." I set my spoon down, resting my hands in my lap. "I do not have a mortgage, Dad. The house is fully handled." My mother scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Fully handled? What does that even mean? Did you drain your entire savings account just to play pretend in a wealthy neighborhood? You are 35 years old, Cassidy. You cannot keep making these impulsive, childish decisions. What about your health insurance? Are you still on that catastrophic coverage plan? It is completely irresponsible to buy a luxury home when you do not even have a stable corporate salary." I looked over at Richard Harrington. He was quietly cutting a piece of bread, pretending not to listen, but I could see the slight furrow in his brow. He was observing the family dynamic, likely wondering why his top associate's family was so aggressively hostile toward their own daughter. Jason, sensing that the spotlight had drifted away from him for too long, quickly swooped back in to deliver the killing blow. "Let her be, Mom," Jason said with a theatrical sigh of pity. "Running a glorified customer service app out of a spare bedroom is tough work. She needs all the fake square footage she can get to feel like a real CEO. Just let her have her little internet project. It keeps her busy. A glorified customer service app." The dining room fell into a brief, heavy silence. My parents exchanged a knowing, exhausted look, silently agreeing with Jason's brutal assessment. Natalie looked down at her lap, too intimidated by the sheer force of our parents' disapproval to defend me any further. DeAndre tightened his grip on his napkin, his jaw locked in silent outrage. I did not break. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up my wine glass, taking a slow, appreciative sip of the cheap Pinot Noir my mother had banished to the kitchen, which Maria had secretly poured for me anyway. I let the silence stretch for just a moment longer, allowing Jason's smug satisfaction to fully settle over his features. Then I turned my attention directly to him. If the algorithm is just a fast librarian, Jason, I began, my voice carrying a sudden piercing clarity that cut through the ambient noise of the room. How exactly is your firm handling the automated recursive loops in the data privacy module? Jason blinked. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Excuse me? I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. The Aegis platform uses a recursive machine learning loop to update its compliance models. But if you apply that to state-by-state privacy regulations, the software risks a false positive feedback loop when dealing with conflicting jurisdictions like California and New York. If you have been rewriting the legal parameters for the integration, how did you bypass the encryption without triggering the system's automatic data purge? The color instantly drained from Jason's face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He stared at me like I had just started speaking fluent Mandarin. He had absolutely no idea what I was talking about because he did not actually understand the software his firm was buying. He only knew the buzzwords. I watched his eyes dart nervously toward Richard Harrington. Well, Jason stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all its previous booming confidence. That is a highly technical issue, Cass. It is not something you would understand. We have our IT department looking at the server-side things. I am handling the legal framework. You are just throwing around big words you read on a tech blog. Let us stick to things you actually know. He let out a forced, breathy laugh, trying to brush off my question as nonsense. My parents immediately chuckled along with him, relieved that Jason had put me back in my place. But Richard Harrington did not laugh. The managing partner of the firm slowly put his knife down. He picked up his linen napkin, wiped his mouth, and turned his head to look directly at me. His eyes were sharp, evaluating, and suddenly entirely focused. He ignored Jason completely. That is a very specific question, Cassidy, Richard said, his deep voice silencing the table instantly. In fact, that specific recursive loop issue is the exact hurdle our senior engineering team has spent the last 3 months trying to decode with the Aegis developers. We have had teams working weekends trying to understand that exact data purge trigger. Richard tilted his head, his gaze piercing through me. How exactly do you know about the internal architecture of a highly classified proprietary platform? When I returned from parking the Lexus, the heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the stifling atmosphere of my parents' house. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic rosemary and the overwhelming perfume my mother wore exclusively for company. I walked into the formal dining room where the seating arrangement had already been carefully orchestrated by my mother to reflect the exact hierarchy of our family. The long mahogany table was draped in imported white linen and set with my grandmother's vintage silver, the kind that required Maria to spend hours polishing it the day before. At the head of the table sat my father, radiating self-importance. Immediately to his right, in the undisputed seat of honor, was Richard Harrington. And directly across from Richard, positioned perfectly to maintain uninterrupted eye contact and monopolize the conversation, was Jason. I was relegated to the very opposite end of the table, seated nearest to the swinging kitchen door, a physical manifestation of my status. My younger sister Natalie sat quietly across from me, her eyes fixed on her water glass, while her husband DeAndre took the seat to my left. DeAndre gave me a brief, knowing look as I sat down. He understood the dynamics of this room better than anyone who married into the family. Maria silently moved around the table, pouring water and serving the first course, a delicate butternut squash bisque. Before anyone could even pick up a spoon, my father tapped his crystal wine glass with his knife, The sharp, ringing sound commanded absolute silence. "I would like to propose a toast," my father announced, his chest puffed out beneath his tailored dress shirt. "To our esteemed guest, Richard Harrington. We are deeply honored to have you at our Thanksgiving table. And of course to my son Jason, whose tireless dedication to the firm continues to make his mother and me incredibly proud." My mother beamed, raising her glass with a theatrical flourish. "Hear, hear," she chimed in, her eyes shining with absolute adoration as she looked at Jason. I quietly lifted my glass of water, taking a small sip. I noticed that my father did not mention Natalie DeAndre or myself. We were merely background extras in the grand production of Jason's life. Richard offered a polite, practiced smile and raised his own glass in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Thomas Brenda. It is a pleasure to be here. Your son is certainly ambitious. We have a massive quarter ahead of us, and we are relying heavily on our senior associates to step up." That was all the opening Jason needed. The moment the glasses were set down, he seized control of the conversation with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed his own press. "Actually, Richard the First was reviewing the final integration protocols for the new tech acquisition before I drove over here tonight," Jason said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. He deliberately used a tone that was slightly too loud, ensuring that his corporate jargon reached every corner of the room. My parents immediately stopped eating and leaned in their faces, masks of rapt attention. They had absolutely no idea what integration protocols meant, but they loved the way it sounded. "It is a monumental shift for the firm," Jason continued, gesturing expansively with his hands. "We are completely overhauling our mergers and acquisitions compliance department. We are acquiring an artificial intelligence platform that handles regulatory frameworks. Naturally, the legal parameters of transferring that kind of proprietary technology are a nightmare. But I have been spearheading the transition, mapping out the liability clauses, and let me tell you, it requires a very specific type of analytical engineering to ensure the software does not violate state privacy laws when we plug it into our mainframe." I kept my head down, focusing intensely on my soup to hide the smirk that was threatening to break across my face. It was taking every ounce of my willpower not to burst into hysterical laughter. Jason was lying. He was lying with such conviction that he probably believed his own words. The platform his firm was acquiring was my company Aegis. And I knew for an absolute fact that the compliance protocols of my platform were locked behind end-to-end encryption. No one at his firm, not even Richard Harrington himself, had the administrative clearance to rewrite a single line of my code. Jason was simply reviewing the external user manuals and drafting basic liability waivers, but he was packaging it to sound like he was personally engineering the software. "That sounds incredibly complex, Jason," my father said, shaking his head in manufactured awe. "You must be working around the clock to handle that kind of high-level technology." "It takes a rigorous mind," Jason agreed, feigning a humble sigh. "The core algorithm is an absolute beast. I have spent the last month practically rewriting their compliance safeguards. You really have to know how to speak the language of the machine to prevent a catastrophic data leak during the handover." I took a slow piece of bread from the basket and buttered it. The technical gibberish he was spewing was actually physically painful to listen to. He was combining random tech buzzwords he had probably read in a business article that morning. As Jason continued his monologue, his eyes swept down the table, soaking in the admiration of his parents. But when his gaze landed on me, his smug expression tightened. I was not looking at him with awe. I was casually eating my bread, looking completely unimpressed. To Jason, my lack of worship was a direct challenge. He could not stand the idea that the family dropout was not intimidated by his corporate vocabulary. He decided right then and there to use me as a prop to further elevate his own intellect. "I know this is probably flying right over your head, Cassidy," Jason suddenly called out, projecting his voice down the length of the table. The entire room went quiet. The warm, congratulatory atmosphere instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp, familiar tension. My mother stopped cutting her meat and glared at me silently, warning me not to embarrass the family. I looked up, meeting Jason's arrogant stare. I did not say a word. I just waited. Let me break it down for you, Jason said, offering a condescending smile that made my stomach turn. I know you struggled with the heavy reading back when you were briefly at Columbia Law, so I will try to keep the corporate jargon to a minimum. He picked up his silver spoon and pointed it at me like a teacher addressing a particularly slow child. Think of this new software like a very fast librarian, Jason explained, speaking slowly and articulating every syllable. This program basically reads the complicated law books for us and flags the spelling errors. It is essentially a giant digital filing cabinet. We put the papers in, and the computer puts them in alphabetical order, so the lawyers do not have to. Does that make sense to you? He was comparing a predictive neural network capable of cross-referencing decades of international corporate case law across multiple jurisdictions in under 3 seconds to a digital filing cabinet. He was explaining my own life's work to me as if I were a toddler trying to understand a coloring book. My father chuckled a low, approving sound that echoed Jason's disrespect. Exactly, Jason, my father said. Keep it simple. Natalie looked down at her lap, her shoulders tense, too intimidated by the sheer force of our parents' approval to defend me. My mother took a delicate sip of her wine, looking at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. I sat perfectly still. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not raise my voice or launch into a defensive argument about my intelligence. I simply looked at Jason, looked at the man who was about to pay me $120 million for that exact digital filing cabinet, and allowed myself a single, subtle eye roll. It was a microscopic shift in my expression, a brief flash of absolute exasperation that I quickly masked with a blank stare. But DeAndre caught it. DeAndre had been sitting quietly next to me, observing the entire exchange with the sharp, clinical eye of a man who dealt with high-stress situations every single day. As a pediatric nurse, DeAndre had an incredibly low tolerance for bullies, and an even lower tolerance for my family's fabricated drama. He saw my eye roll. He saw the tight, controlled way I was gripping my napkin, and he saw exactly what Jason was trying to do. DeAndre shifted his weight in his chair. He picked up his heavy silver fork and set it down against his china plate with a loud, sharp clink that echoed through the quiet dining room. He squared his shoulders, looking directly down the table at the golden child, and decided it was time to completely derail Jason's runaway train of self-importance. DeAndre cleared his throat, his deep voice easily cutting through the remaining echoes of Jason's arrogant lecture. You know, Jason, if we are talking about making major moves, we really should be raising a glass to Cassidy tonight, DeAndre said, offering me a warm and genuine smile. Natalie and I drove past your new place in Evanston yesterday. That house is absolutely stunning. Closing on a historical craftsman property in that neighborhood, especially in this insane housing market, is a massive accomplishment. Congratulations, Cass. I felt a sudden rush of gratitude for my brother-in-law. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was deliberately throwing a wrench into the machinery of my parents' Jason worship. Buying that house was a huge milestone for me. It was a beautiful, sprawling 4-bedroom property with original hardwood floors, a wrap-around porch, and a massive backyard. And the best part was that I had paid for it entirely in cash 2 weeks ago, using only a microscopic fraction of my company's operating revenue. But in my family, any praise directed at me was treated as a direct threat to Jason's supremacy. The dining room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. My mother dropped her salad fork. The silver hit her china plate with a sharp clatter. The warm, proud smile she had been giving Jason vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of deep, exaggerated concern. Oh, DeAndre, please do not encourage this reckless behavior. My mother sighed heavily, pressing her manicured fingers to her temples, as if the very thought of my new home gave her a physical migraine. I have been absolutely sick with worry ever since she told us about that place. Mom, it is a really great house. Natalie finally spoke up, her voice quiet and hesitant. She kept her eyes glued to her water glass, terrified of drawing the crosshairs onto herself. It has a beautiful yard, and the neighborhood is very safe. That is exactly the problem, Natalie. My mother snapped, her voice sharp and uncompromising. A neighborhood like that comes with astronomical property taxes and maintenance costs. Cassidy, you did not use one of those predatory subprime lenders, did you? Because I am telling you right now, your father and I are preparing for our retirement. When the bank forecloses on that place because you cannot make the monthly payments, we will not be bailing you out. You are completely on your own. I took a slow piece of bread from the basket and buttered it. I do not have a mortgage, Mom, I said calmly. The house is fully handled. My father let out a harsh, condescending laugh from the head of the table. Fully handled. What does that even mean, Cassidy? Did you drain whatever tiny savings account you had, just to play pretend in a wealthy neighborhood? You are 34 years old. You cannot keep making these impulsive, childish financial decisions just to keep up appearances. First, you throw away a perfectly good education at Columbia, and now you are playing real estate mogul with empty pockets. I looked over at Richard Harrington. He was quietly cutting his roasted vegetables, pretending not to listen, but I could see the slight furrow in his brow. He was observing the family dynamic, likely wondering why his top associate's family was so aggressively hostile toward their own daughter over buying a house. It was a terrible look for Jason to come from a family that bullied their own, but my parents were too blinded by their own toxicity to realize they were embarrassing their golden boy in front of his boss. What about your health insurance? My mother pressed, leaning across the table like a hostile interrogator. Is your little internet project finally making enough money to cover basic medical care, or are you still on that catastrophic coverage plan? It is completely irresponsible to buy a luxury home when you do not even have a stable corporate salary. You are playing a very dangerous game with your future. Natalie shrank further into her chair, completely defeated by our parents' overwhelming negativity. She gave me a small apologetic look before returning her focus to her plate. DeAndre tightened his grip on his napkin, his jaw locked in silent outrage. He opened his mouth to defend me again, but Jason quickly swooped in, sensing that the spotlight had drifted away from him for entirely too long. "Let her be, Mom," Jason said with a theatrical sigh of pity. He turned to Richard Harrington, offering his boss an apologetic, conspiratorial smile. "You have to excuse my sister, Richard. She runs a glorified customer service app out of her spare bedroom. It is a tough market, so she needs all the fake square footage she can get to feel like a real CEO. Do not worry, she is definitely not a flight risk to our industry. Just let her have her little internet project. It keeps her busy while the rest of us do the actual heavy lifting. A glorified customer service app." The dining room fell into a brief, heavy silence. My parents exchanged a knowing, exhausted look, silently agreeing with Jason's brutal assessment. They looked at me as if I were a stain on their otherwise perfect Thanksgiving table. I did not break. I did not flush with embarrassment or raise my voice. I did not launch into a desperate defensive argument about my intelligence or my bank account. Instead, I simply picked up my wine glass, taking a slow, appreciative sip of the cheap Pinot Noir my mother had banished to the kitchen. I let the silence stretch for just a moment longer, allowing Jason's smug satisfaction to fully settle over his features. I looked at the golden child sitting there in his expensive suit, desperate for the approval of a man whose company I was about to technically own. For 5 years I had swallowed their insults. For 5 years I had let them rewrite my narrative from a brilliant law student to a pathetic dropout. I had done it because my work required absolute secrecy, and because part of me still foolishly hoped they would eventually see my worth without needing a dollar amount attached to it. But as I looked at the sheer contempt in my mother's eyes and the arrogant smirk on my brother's face, that hope finally evaporated. The embargo on my press release was lifting in less than an hour. My company was sold. My future was secured, and I had absolutely nothing left to hide. I set my wine glass down on the crisp white linen. The soft clink drew everyone's attention. I looked directly at Jason, my expression completely blank, and I finally decided to speak. The silence in the dining room was absolute. My mother sat frozen with her wine glass halfway to her mouth. My father stared at Richard Harrington in utter disbelief, entirely unable to process why the most powerful man in the room was suddenly speaking to his massive disappointment of a daughter with such intense, unblinking respect. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, "Richard," Jason panicked. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as he leaned aggressively across the table, desperately trying to physically block Richard from looking at me. "She does not know anything about the architecture." Richard Jason laughed loudly. It was a harsh, synthetic sound that completely lacked his usual polished charm. "She is just throwing around buzzwords she read on some tech blog this morning." Cassidy spends half her day scrolling through internet forums. "She is just trying to sound smart for the family. You know how it is. People who drop out of rigorous programs always have to compensate by pretending they understand high-level engineering." Jason then turned to me, his eyes wide and frantic, silently begging me to back down. But I just sat there, my posture relaxed, looking back at him with a calm, empty expression. I was not going to save him. He had dug this grave with his own arrogance, and I was more than happy to hand him the shovel. "Actually, Jason," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, "a recursive machine learning loop applied to multi-state privacy regulations is not a buzzword. It is the fundamental core of the Aegis platform. If your firm integrates the software without establishing a localized sandbox environment for California-based data, the system will automatically trigger a mass purge of all conflicting case files to avoid violating the California Consumer Privacy Act. You would lose decades of proprietary client data in a matter of seconds." The color completely drained from Jason's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to take hold. He desperately tried to pull himself back up, puffing out his chest and adopting his most condescending courtroom voice. "That is completely incorrect, Cassidy." Jason stated, his voice trembling slightly, despite his best efforts to sound authoritative. "That is not how artificial intelligence works at all. The firm is setting up a secure blockchain firewall to prevent any data from crossing state lines. The algorithm simply routes the information through our internal cloud network. It is a closed circuit. There is absolutely no risk of a data purge because I personally reviewed the liability waivers." I stared at him. DeAndre stared at him. Even Natalie, who barely knew how to restart her own laptop, looked up from her plate with a confused expression. Jason had just strung together a series of completely unrelated technological terms that made absolutely no sense. A blockchain firewall did not exist. Routing an artificial intelligence through a closed-circuit cloud network was an oxymoron. He was quite literally speaking gibberish, hoping that his confident delivery would mask his profound ignorance. I did not even have to correct him. I just looked over at Richard Harrington. The managing partner of the elite law firm was sitting perfectly still, staring at his senior associate with an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. Richard was not a software engineer, but he was a brilliant man who had spent the last 3 months in endless meetings with top-tier developers. He knew enough to recognize that the man he had entrusted with the legal framework of a $120 million tech acquisition had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. "Jason," Richard said slowly, his deep voice carrying a sudden dangerous edge, "the Aegis platform does not use blockchain technology, and a closed-circuit cloud network is a contradiction in terms. Are you telling me you do not understand the localized data purge protocols?" Jason swallowed hard. A bead of sweat formed at his hairline. "No, Richard, of course I understand them," he stammered, his polished facade cracking into a million pieces. "I was just trying to simplify the concepts for my sister. Dumb it down so she could follow the conversation. She just runs a little customer service application. I did not want to overwhelm her with the actual high-level mechanics of the merger." Jason let out another forced, desperate laugh and pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is just trying to use big words to impress you, Richard," Jason sneered, his panic quickly morphing into vicious cruelty. "She could not even handle the reading assignments at Columbia. She had to pack her bags and run away because she could not compete." Now she sits in her bedroom answering emails all day. Please do not listen to a word she says about corporate compliance. My father immediately jumped in to rescue his golden boy, sensing that the dynamic at the table had shifted in a very dangerous direction. Cassidy, that is quite enough, my father barked from the head of the table. His face was flushed red with anger. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this family. Jason works 80 hours a week handling multi-million-dollar contracts. Do not come to this table and try to undermine your brother with internet trivia just because you are jealous of his success. My mother nodded vigorously, clutching her linen napkin. Really, Cassidy, your behavior tonight is completely unacceptable, she scolded. Jason and Mr. Harrington are discussing highly confidential corporate business. It is incredibly rude of you to interrupt them with your little freelance computer theories. Why do you not go into the kitchen and help Maria bring out the next course? I think we could all use a moment to reset. They were trying to physically remove me from the room to protect Jason's ego. They were perfectly willing to treat me like a servant to ensure their golden child did not look like a fool in front of his boss. I looked at my mother. I looked at my father. And then I looked directly at Jason, who was smirking at me, mistakenly believing that our parents had just saved his career. I did not stand up. I did not go to the kitchen. I simply leaned back in my chair, picked up my water glass, and took a slow sip. I am staying right here, Mom, I said calmly, setting the glass down. The conversation was just getting interesting. Richard Harrington did not look at my parents. He did not look at Jason. His eyes remained fixed firmly on me. The annoyance he had shown toward me at the front door was completely gone, replaced by a deep, intense fascination. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy mahogany table, completely ignoring the tension radiating from the rest of my family. If the localized sandbox environment is the solution, Cassidy Richards said, quietly speaking to me, as if we were the only two people in the room, how would you structure the parameters to ensure the California data does not accidentally cross-contaminate with the federal compliance algorithms? Our engineering team suggested a hard server split, but that would cost us an extra $2 million in hardware upgrades. Jason choked on his own breath. He looked at his boss as if Richard had just lost his mind. My parents sat frozen in stunned silence, entirely unable to comprehend why the managing partner of a prestigious law firm was asking their dropout daughter for high-level consulting advice at the Thanksgiving table. A hard server split is entirely unnecessary, and a massive waste of capital, I replied smoothly, meeting Richard's intense gaze without flinching. You do not need new hardware. You just need to rewrite the state-specific parameter fencing within the primary code. If you isolate the California regulations into a shadow server environment that only triggers when a California zip code is detected by the client intake, the system will naturally quarantine the conflicting data without ever needing a physical server split. It takes exactly 3 lines of new code to execute. Richard stared at me. His mouth parted slightly. He slowly reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a silver pen, and grabbed a custom-printed napkin from the table. A shadow server environment, triggered by the intake zip code, Richard murmured to himself, quickly writing the concept down on the napkin. That is brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant. It solves the entire data contamination issue without spending a single dollar on new servers. He stopped writing and looked up at me, his expression a mixture of profound respect and deep confusion. Cassidy, Richard asked, his voice low and serious. Who exactly do you work for? The trap was fully set. The tension in the room was pulled so tight it felt like the crystal wine glasses were about to shatter. Jason was trembling. My parents were completely speechless. I glanced at the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dining room. It was 7:45 in the evening. I had exactly 15 minutes left before the global financial networks announced my name to the world. Before I could give Richard an answer, Jason slammed his hands down on the table, desperate to regain control of his shattered reality. Before I could even formulate a response to Richard, Jason slammed both of his hands flat against the heavy mahogany table. The sudden impact caused the crystal water glasses to rattle dangerously, the sharp sound cutting through the thick tension in the room. He was completely panicked. The realization that his boss was genuinely interested in my intellect had shattered his fragile reality, and he needed an immediate distraction to regain control of the room. He physically thrust himself forward, blocking my line of sight to Richard, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and deep-seated rage. Right on cue, the swinging doors of the kitchen pushed open. Maria walked into the dining room, carrying a massive ornate silver platter holding the main course. The timing could not have been more perfect for Jason's desperate escape strategy. A rich, savory aroma immediately filled the air, temporarily masking the bitter hostility that had just poisoned the conversation. "Oh, fantastic!" Jason practically shouted, his voice artificially loud and laced with a manic energy. "The main event has finally arrived. Richard, you are going to want to pay close attention to this. Forget about all that boring tech compliance nonsense. We are off the clock. It is time to truly celebrate." Jason stood up from his chair, completely ignoring the profound confusion on Richard's face. He walked over to the serving buffet where Maria had carefully placed the heavy platter. He grabbed the carving knife and fork from her hands, dismissing her with a careless flick of his wrist. Maria stepped back, her eyes downcast, retreating to the kitchen without a word. Jason puffed out his chest and stood over the roasted meat as if he had personally hunted and prepared it himself. "This right here," Jason announced to the table, gesturing broadly with the carving knife, "is authentic grade A5 Japanese Wagyu beef. I had it specially imported by a private butcher downtown. You cannot even find this cut in a standard high-end grocery store. It requires a specific vendor license just to order it." He looked around the table, desperate to see the familiar looks of worship return to our parents' faces. My father Thomas immediately took the bait. He leaned forward, inhaling deeply, his eyes wide with exaggerated appreciation. "That is incredibly impressive, Jason," my father declared, nodding solemnly. "I was wondering why the house smelled like a five-star restaurant. You really outdid yourself this year. Only the best for this family." My mother Brenda clapped her hands together in delight. She looked at Richard, making sure he was witnessing her son's incredible generosity. "Jason is a true connoisseur, Richard," she bragged. "He always insists on treating us to the finer things in life. We are just so spoiled by him." Jason soaked up their praise like a dying man finding water in the desert. His panic began to subside, replaced by his usual arrogant swagger. He began slicing the meat with slow, theatrical precision, making sure everyone noticed the intricate marbling and perfect sear. He plated the first portion and walked it directly over to Richard, setting it down with a flourish. He then served our parents, who accepted the plates as if they were receiving sacred offerings. Finally, he served Natalie, DeAndre, and me. When Jason returned to his seat at the head of the table, he did not pick up his fork. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times, unlocking it, and then held it up so the glowing screen illuminated his smug expression. Now Jason began, his voice dropping into a casual, transactional tone. "I am going to need everyone to go ahead and open up their Venmo apps." Natalie stopped with her fork halfway to her mouth. DeAndre let out a heavy sigh, dropping his napkin onto his lap with a look of pure disgust. Richard Harrington froze, staring at Jason with a look of utter bewilderment. The managing partner of a prestigious law firm was sitting at a holiday table watching his senior associate shake down his own family members for dinner money. It was a spectacular display of social incompetence, but my parents were so deeply conditioned to Jason's behavior that they did not even flinch. The total for the butcher invoice came out to exactly $800, Jason stated, his eyes scanning the table as he calculated the math in his head. "Since there are 6 of us eating, not counting Richard, because he is our honored guest, of course, that breaks down to roughly $133 per person. Let us just round it up to $150 each to cover the delivery fee and tip I gave the driver." My father immediately pulled his phone out of his pocket. "Absolutely, Jason. I am sending you $300 right now to cover your mother and me. It is worth every penny to share a meal like this." My mother smiled warmly at Jason. Thank you for handling the logistics, sweetheart. You are always so responsible. Jason nodded, accepting their money as his absolute right. He then turned his attention to my sister. Natalie, I will send you the request right now. You and DeAndre can split your portion however you want. DeAndre clenched his jaw. He looked at Jason, his voice low and tight with restrained anger. Jason Natalie spent 3 days baking all the pies, preparing the side dishes, and setting up the decorations. I brought 4 bottles of wine. We are not paying you $300 for a roast we did not ask you to order. Jason rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, patronizing sigh. Come on, DeAndre, do not be cheap. It is a holiday. You are eating world-class beef, you should be expected to chip in. It is just common courtesy. Before DeAndre could completely lose his temper and flip the table, Jason deliberately shifted his gaze away from my brother-in-law and locked his eyes directly onto me. The arrogant smirk returned to his face, sharper and more vicious than before. He had found his ultimate target. He wanted to punish me for making him look foolish in front of his boss just moments ago, and he knew that attacking my financial status was his most effective weapon. Jason looked down at my plate where a small piece of the Wagyu beef rested next to my roasted vegetables. He tilted his head, his eyes swimming with manufactured sympathy and fake pity. I know things are a little tight right now, Cass, Jason said, his voice dripping with condescension. Especially with you trying to play house in that expensive new neighborhood. If you cannot afford the $150, you do not have to be embarrassed. Just say the word. I am more than happy to cover your share for you. I know how hard it is for dropouts to scrape together extra cash at the end of the month. Consider it my holiday gift to you. The room fell completely silent. The sheer cruelty of the insult hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jason was publicly humiliating me, branding me as a charity case in front of his boss and our entire family, all while pretending to be a generous benefactor. My father immediately chimed in to support his golden son. Thomas pointed a stern finger at me from across the table. Your brother works very hard for his money, Cassidy. He bills 80 hours a week at a top law firm. If he is kind enough to cover your expenses tonight, the least you can do is show some gratitude. A simple thank you would be appropriate. My mother nodded in agreement, taking a delicate sip of her wine. It really is very sweet of you, Jason, to take care of your sister like that. We just worry about her so much. It is nice to know she has family to rely on when her little internet projects do not pan out. They sat there, a united front of toxicity, waiting for me to lower my head. They waited for the familiar flush of shame to color my cheeks. They waited for me to quietly accept their charity and acknowledge my own failure, just as I had done for the last 5 years. I looked at Jason. I looked at the smug, triumphant grin plastered across his face. And then I looked at Richard Harrington, who was watching me with an expression of intense anticipation, silently waiting to see how the brilliant mind behind the Aegis platform would handle this absurd display of family bullying. I did not lower my head. I did not blush. Instead, a profound and terrifying calmness washed over me. All the remaining warmth completely drained from my face, leaving behind an expression of ice-cold detachment. Without saying a single word, I slowly reached down to the floor beside my chair, unclasped the gold hardware of my leather handbag, and reached inside. My fingers brushed against the smooth leather of my wallet. I pulled it out, unsnapped the closure, and withdrew a single piece of solid titanium. I did not break eye contact with my brother as I casually tossed the matte black American Express Centurion card across the table. It slid over the imported white linen and stopped right next to his perfectly plated Wagyu beef, landing with a heavy, distinct thud that no piece of plastic could ever make. Put the entire dinner on this, Jason, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. The $800 for the butcher, the delivery fee, the tip, and whatever else you want to charge for your time. In fact, cover the wine and the groceries Mom bought for the side dishes too. My treat. Happy Thanksgiving. The dining room went completely dead silent. It was the kind of profound ringing silence that only happens when a fundamental law of gravity is suddenly reversed in front of a room full of people. Nobody moved, nobody chewed. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. The matte black metal of the card gleamed under the warm light of the crystal chandelier overhead. It did not look like a normal credit card because it was not a normal credit card. It was the ultimate symbol of unregulated financial power. You could not simply apply for a Centurion card. You had to be personally invited by American Express after spending millions of dollars annually, and the initiation fee alone cost more than the cars parked in my parents' driveway. It was a card that could purchase a private jet or a luxury yacht on a Tuesday afternoon without a single security flag being raised. Jason stared at the black rectangle resting next to his plate. He blinked rapidly, his brain desperately trying to compute the visual information in front of him. For a brief second, I saw genuine shock flash across his features. But then the family conditioning kicked in. Instead of realization, my parents instantly pivoted to aggressive, spectacular denial. Their minds simply could not process a reality where the family failure possessed more wealth than their golden child. So they immediately began constructing a narrative to protect their delusions. Cassidy. "What on earth is this?" my mother demanded, breaking the silence with a harsh, dismissive scoff. "Are you taking out predatory credit cards just to put on a show for us tonight? This is exactly what your father was talking about earlier with your reckless financial decisions. You cannot just sign up for high-interest gimmick cards to pretend you have money." My father slammed his hand on the table, shaking his head in deep disappointment. "Put that away right now, Cassidy," he barked, his face flushing red with anger. "You are going to completely ruin your credit score playing pretend. Do you have any idea what the interest rates are on these ridiculous premium cards? You are going to be in debt for the rest of your life just because you wanted to show off at the dinner table. It is pathetic." Natalie kept her eyes glued to her plate, her shoulders tense. DeAndre, however, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at the card, then looked at me, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. DeAndre was not fooled by my parents' mental gymnastics. He knew exactly what that card was. Jason, eager to completely invalidate my gesture, reached out and picked up the heavy titanium card. He weighed it in his hand, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the raised numbers and the authentic branding. But instead of admitting defeat, he let out a loud, jagged laugh and tossed the card back onto the table like it was a piece of trash. "It is a fake," Jason announced to the room, looking at our parents with a relieved smirk. "She bought a novelty metal card on the internet. You can order these online for $50 from those cheap custom engraving websites. People buy them to look rich at bars." She just transferred her basic checking account information onto a blank piece of metal to look cool in front of Richard. "It is honestly just sad." My mother let out a dramatic sigh of relief, pressing her hand to her chest. "Oh, thank goodness," she breathed out. "For a second, I thought you had actually ruined your financial future, Cassidy. Really, though, bringing a prop to a family dinner is a new low even for you." They were all laughing now. A chorus of condescending, relieved laughter echoed around the table as they comfortably settled back into their established dynamic. They had successfully neutralized the threat. The universe made sense again. Cassidy was just a pathetic dropout playing dress-up. But I was not looking at my laughing family. I was looking directly at Richard Harrington. Richard was not laughing. The managing partner of the elite law firm sat perfectly still, his eyes locked onto the black metal card resting on the white linen. He did not need to pick it up to know it was real. Men like Richard Harrington moved in circles where that specific card was a standard accessory. He likely had the exact same card sitting inside his own leather wallet at that very moment. He recognized the authentic matte finish, the precise weight distribution of the titanium, and the unmistakable aura of true quiet wealth. Richard slowly lifted his gaze from the card and looked at me. The polite, superficial mask he had worn all evening completely vanished. His eyes were wide, calculating, and filled with a sudden, intense realization. He realized that Jason's confident explanation was a complete fabrication. He realized that my parents were blinding themselves to the truth. And most importantly, he realized that the woman sitting quietly at the end of the table was entirely out of their league. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and lacing his fingers together. The ambient laughter from my family faded into the background as the most powerful man in the room addressed me directly, ignoring Jason entirely. "Cassidy," Richard said softly, his voice cutting through the noise with absolute authority. "You never did answer my question earlier. What exactly do you do for a living?" The question hung in the heavy air of the dining room like a lit fuse. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Richard Jason forcefully inserted himself between us. He lunged forward in his chair, leaning so far over his plate that his expensive silk tie nearly dipped into the expensive meat he had just served himself. "Richard, I am so sorry about this." Jason practically pleaded, his voice high and tight with absolute panic. "Please do not encourage her delusion. This is exactly what she wants. She brings these little props to family gatherings just to get attention, because she knows she cannot compete with real professionals in the real world. It is a fake card. She probably bought it on a joke website for $20. My father immediately backed him up, slamming his heavy hand against the table and rattling the silverware. "Cassidy, put that toy away this instant," my father commanded, using the exact same tone he used to scold me when I was a disobedient child. "You are humiliating your brother in front of his boss. Have you absolutely no shame at all? This is a celebration of Jason and his hard work, not a time for your childish pranks." My mother reached for her wine glass with a trembling hand, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had just wandered into her home. "I just do not understand why you have to ruin every holiday, Cassidy," she whispered dramatically, pressing her free hand to her chest. "You are 34 years old, and you are sitting here playing make-believe with a fake credit card. It is genuinely disturbing. We should probably look into getting you some psychological help, because this compulsive need to steal the spotlight from Jason is getting entirely out of hand." They were a united front of pure gaslighting. They were so deeply committed to the narrative of my failure that they were willing to ignore the physical evidence sitting right in front of them. I did not defend myself. I did not yell or try to justify my existence to them. I just kept my eyes locked perfectly on Richard Harrington. The managing partner of the elite law firm completely ignored my frantic family. He did not blink. He did not break eye contact with me. Slowly and deliberately, Richard reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek leather wallet, opened it, slid out a heavy piece of black metal and placed it gently on the white linen tablecloth right next to my card. The two pieces of solid titanium sat side by side under the warm glow of the crystal chandelier. They were completely identical. They shared the same matte black finish. They had the same intricate silver lettering. They had the exact same embedded security chips. "You know, Jason," Richard said, his deep voice dangerously quiet and incredibly calm. "I have carried this specific card in my wallet for over a decade. I know exactly how much it weighs in the palm of my hand. I know exactly the specific acoustic resonance the titanium makes when it hits a solid mahogany table. But more importantly, I know that a cheap internet novelty card does not possess an active micro-laser engraved secure EMV chip." Richard reached out and tapped a perfectly manicured finger against my card. "This card is authentic," Richard stated flatly, his words dropping like heavy stones into the silent room. "To even be considered for this account, American Express has to personally invite you. You have to spend and pay off a minimum of $250,000 a year just to keep it active. The initiation fee alone is $10,000. So I am going to ask you one more time, Jason, why are you telling me your sister is a broke dropout when she is casually carrying a card that not even our senior partners qualify to hold?" The absolute shock on Jason's face was a masterpiece. He stared at the two identical black cards as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike him. But instead of admitting he was wrong, his brain completely short-circuited. He simply could not accept a reality where I was more successful than him. He scrambled for any possible explanation that kept me firmly at the bottom of the family hierarchy. She must have stolen it, Jason blurted out, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. Or maybe she is dating some rich old guy who gave her a supplementary card to use. Richard, I swear to you, she does not have that kind of money. She lives in a total fantasy world. She runs a little website out of her bedroom. She cannot even afford her own health insurance. My mother gasped loudly, completely buying into Jason's desperate theory. "Oh my God, Thomas," she said, turning to my father with a look of pure horror. "Do you think she is involved in something illegal? Identity theft, fraud. I knew she could not afford that massive house in Evanston legitimately. We cannot be associated with this." DeAndre let out a loud, booming laugh that startled everyone at the table. "You people are absolutely unbelievable," DeAndre said, shaking his head in total disgust. "Your daughter sits here holding undeniable proof of her massive success, and your first instinct is to accuse her of a felony, just to protect Jason's fragile ego. It is pathetic. It is actually sick." I raised my hand slightly, signaling DeAndre that I appreciated him, but that I did not need him to fight this battle for me anymore. I looked directly at Richard Harrington, who was watching me with an intensity that made the rest of the room completely fade away. "You asked what I do for a living, Richard?" I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely professional. "I build automated compliance frameworks for Tier 1 corporate law firms. I design the exact recursive algorithms your engineering team has been failing to decode for the last 3 months." Jason completely lost his mind. He let out a sharp, hysterical bark of laughter. He grabbed his linen napkin and threw it down violently onto his plate. "Listen to her, Richard," Jason sneered, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "She is completely delusional. She heard me talking about the tech acquisition earlier, and now she is trying to pretend she knows how to code. She is a compulsive liar. She runs a glorified customer service app. Please just ignore her before she embarrasses herself any further." Before Jason could continue his frantic character assassination, a sharp, prolonged buzzing sound cut through his rant. It was my smartphone resting face up on the table next to my water glass. The bright screen illuminated the faces of my family. I glanced down. It was a secure priority message from my lead broker in New York. The SEC paperwork had officially cleared. The holding funds were fully unlocked. I checked the digital clock in the corner of my screen. It was exactly 8:00. The media embargo had officially lifted. The screen of my smartphone glowed brightly against the white linen tablecloth, displaying a secure text message from my lead broker in New York. The text was brief, but it carried the weight of the last 5 years of my life. It read, "SEC, filings are fully executed. The wire transfer is confirmed, and holding funds are unlocked. The press release just went live on Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal. Congratulations, C. Davis." I stared at the glowing words, feeling a profound sense of finality wash over me. The ghost I had been playing for half a decade was finally dead. I was no longer a secret. I locked my phone screen and placed it face down on the table, folding my hands neatly in my lap. Jason, however, completely misread my silence. He assumed my sudden focus on my phone was a strategic retreat. He thought his vicious outburst had successfully cowed me into submission, just like it always did when we were younger. He let out a loud, triumphant breath and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He turned to Richard Harrington with an expression of deep, manufactured sympathy. "Richard, I sincerely apologize for that outburst," Jason said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have to understand, my sister has always struggled with reality. Ever since she dropped out of Columbia, she has been trying to overcompensate. She builds little websites for local bakeries and small retail shops. It is a glorified customer service app that manages basic email templates. But she reads these tech articles online and tries to insert herself into high-level corporate conversations to feel important. It is a compulsive lying issue. We have been trying to get her to see a therapist for years." My mother immediately nodded, seizing the opportunity to perform her role as the long-suffering matriarch. "It is a tragedy, really." My mother sighed, pressing a napkin to her chest. We gave her every opportunity in the world. We paid for the best tutors, the best schools, and she just threw it all away to sit in a dark room typing on a laptop. She has created this entire fantasy world where she is some sort of Silicon Valley genius. You just have to ignore her, Richard. She does not mean any harm. She is just deeply unwell. My father chimed in, pointing a stern finger in my direction. And looking at your phone at the dinner table while your brother is speaking to his managing partner is the height of disrespect, Cassidy. Put that device away immediately. You have caused enough of a scene tonight. If you cannot behave like a rational adult, you can excuse yourself from this table and go sit in the kitchen with Maria. I did not move. I did not defend myself. I did not tell my father that the device he was ordering me to put away had just confirmed a 9-figure deposit into my holding account. I simply sat there and watched them. It was fascinating in a morbid sort of way to watch 3 grown adults actively construct a fortress of lies to protect themselves from the truth. They were so terrified of my success that they would rather convince the managing partner of an elite law firm that I was a psychiatric patient than admit I was smarter than Jason. DeAndre shifted angrily in his seat next to me. He opened his mouth to tear into my parents, but I gently placed my hand on his forearm under the table. I gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of my head. Let them talk, I communicated silently. Let them dig the hole as deep as they possibly can. Jason took my continued silence as total victory. The arrogant smirk returned to his face, fully restored. He picked up his crystal wine glass, holding it by the stem, and gently swirled the expensive red wine inside. He looked at Richard, his chest puffed out, ready to completely pivot the conversation back to his favorite subject, himself. Anyway, Richard, let us put the family drama aside, Jason announced smoothly, commanding the attention of the entire room. We have much more important things to discuss, specifically the Aegis acquisition. Now that the technical hurdles are out of the way, I have completely finalized the liability waivers for the integration. I will have the final contracts on your desk by 8:30 Monday morning. Richard did not respond immediately. The older man was still staring at me, his sharp eyes flicking between my calm expression and the heavy black American Express card that was still resting on the table. Richard was a man who had made millions of dollars by reading people and identifying bluffs. He knew that I was not bluffing. He could see the absolute certainty in my posture, but he remained quiet, waiting to see exactly how this was going to play out. Jason, entirely oblivious to his boss's internal calculation, raised his glass higher. In fact, Jason continued, his voice booming with unearned confidence. I think a toast is in order. This acquisition is going to put our firm at the absolute forefront of the legal tech industry. We are going to make history this quarter, and I am incredibly proud of the work I have done to secure this transition. I know we have partnership evaluations coming up next week, and I believe my leadership on this project proves that I am ready to step up to the junior partner track. My parents' faces completely lit up. This was the moment they lived for, the ultimate validation of their golden child. My father eagerly raised his own glass, a massive, proud smile stretching across his face. To Jason, my father boomed loudly. To the future junior partner of the firm, you have earned every single bit of your success, son. We could not be more proud of the man you have become. Hear, hear, my mother echoed, raising her glass and gazing at Jason with pure, unfiltered adoration. They clinked their glasses together in the center of the table. A perfect portrait of a wealthy, successful American family. They were completely insulated in their bubble of arrogance and delusion, entirely unaware that the needle was already pressing against the fragile surface of their reality. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I did not touch my water glass. I did not participate in the toast. I just watched Jason take a deep, satisfying drink of his expensive wine, basking in the warm glow of his parents' worship and his own fabricated glory. It was a beautiful moment for him. It was the absolute peak of his entire life. He had convinced himself that he was the smartest man in the room, the savior of his law firm and the undisputed king of our family. He had successfully humiliated his dropout sister and secured his path to unimaginable wealth and prestige. And it was right at that exact moment, while the taste of victory was still fresh on his tongue, that the digital world finally caught up to the physical one. Inside the breast pocket of Richard Harrington's tailored suit jacket, a high-priority financial news alert triggered. A sharp, piercing chime rang out from his smartphone, shattering the celebratory atmosphere of the dining room. A fraction of a second later, Jason's phone resting on the table next to his plate erupted with the exact same urgent notification tone. And then my father's phone buzzed aggressively from inside his trousers. The three devices went off in near-perfect synchronization, a digital chorus of breaking news alerts demanding immediate attention. The Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg Financial, and Forbes were all pushing the exact same massive headline to every corporate subscriber in the country. The embargo was over. The truth was out. And the silence that followed the synchronized ringing was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The lingering echo of the synchronized notifications hung heavily over the dining table, sharply contrasting with the warm, congratulatory toast that had just taken place. For a long moment, nobody moved. The sudden digital intrusion had shattered the carefully constructed atmosphere of my parents' dining room. My father was still holding his crystal wine glass in the air, his proud smile frozen on his face, visibly annoyed that the climax of his golden child celebration had been interrupted by technology. Richard Harrington was the first to react. He set his wine glass down on the white linen tablecloth with a soft thud. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew his smartphone. Given his position as the managing partner of an elite law firm, a priority push notification at 8 o'clock on a holiday evening usually meant a massive corporate crisis or a sudden market shift that required immediate legal triage. He tapped the screen to unlock it, his expression shifting into a mask of pure professional focus. I watched Richard as he read the screen. The transformation was slow but absolutely absolute. The ambient light from his phone illuminated his face, highlighting the deep creases around his eyes as they darted back and forth across the text. He read the notification once. Then his thumb swiped across the screen, opening the full article on the Wall Street Journal application. He read the first paragraph. I could physically see the moment his brain registered the information. His posture, previously relaxed and conversational, instantly turned rigid. His shoulders stiffened. The color slowly began to drain from his face, leaving him looking almost entirely pale under the warm light of the chandelier. My father, completely oblivious to the sudden shift in the managing partner's demeanor, let out a booming, good-natured chuckle. They really do not let you take a single night off, do they, Richard? My father joked loudly, lowering his wine glass and cutting into his expensive beef. That is the price of running the city, I suppose. Even on Thanksgiving, the financial world never sleeps. Jason immediately mirrored our father's laughter, eager to prove that he was also a relentless corporate soldier. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out his smartphone. You can say that again, Dad. Jason chimed in, adopting a faux, weary tone. Let me just check and make sure the junior associates have not set the office on fire while we have been eating. Excuse me for 1 second, Richard. I will handle whatever this is so you can enjoy your meal. Jason tapped his screen. The arrogant, self-satisfied smirk was still firmly plastered across his face as he looked down at his phone. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and watched my brother's entire universe collapse in real time. The smirk did not just fade, it evaporated. It was completely wiped from his features, as if it had never existed at all. Jason stared at the glowing screen of his phone, his eyes widening to an almost comical degree. His jaw went entirely slack. He stopped breathing. The confident, booming senior associate who had spent the entire evening treating me like a pathetic failure was suddenly reduced to a statue of pure, unadulterated terror. He blinked rapidly, desperately, trying to clear his vision, hoping that the words on the screen were some sort of horrible optical illusion. But the words did not change. The massive headline pushed by every major financial news outlet in the country remained exactly the same. The silence in the room returned, but this time it was not a comfortable silence. It was the suffocating heavy silence of a bomb dropping and everyone waiting for the shockwave to hit. Natalie and DeAndre looked back and forth between Jason and Richard, sensing that something catastrophic had just occurred, though they had no idea what it was. My mother stopped chewing her food, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she looked at her golden son's paralyzed expression. Richard Harrington slowly lowered his phone. He did not look at Jason. He did not look at my parents. He slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. The pieces were rapidly snapping together in Richard's brilliant mind. He looked at the heavy, matte black titanium Centurion card that was still resting on the table right next to my plate. He thought about the hyper-complex data privacy question I had asked him 10 minutes ago. He remembered the specific, elegant coding solution I had casually offered to solve a problem that had stumped his entire engineering department for 3 months. And he remembered that his firm had just wired $120 million to a blind trust owned by an anonymous tech genius known only as C. Davis. Cassidy Davis. Richard's eyes met mine. There was no anger in his gaze. There was no condescension. There was only profound, staggering respect mixed with a deep, simmering disgust for the man sitting next to him who had spent the last 2 hours treating a tech titan like a useless servant. I held Richard's gaze and gave him a single slow nod. A silent confirmation. It is me. Richard placed his phone flat on the table. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. The absolute authority he commanded in the courtroom was suddenly present at our Thanksgiving table. Thomas Richard said, his deep voice slicing through the heavy silence. It was cold, entirely professional, and carried the weight of an executioner. I do not believe the firm is requiring Jason's attention tonight. I believe the financial sector is simply announcing a major shift in the market. My father paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. Oh, my father said, blinking in confusion. A market shift. Well, that is good news then. Nothing for Jason to worry about. Jason let out a small strangled gasp. His hands were shaking so violently that his phone rattled against his plate when he tried to set it down. He stared at me from across the table, his face completely bloodless. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the tracks and the train was already 10 feet away. Richard ignored my father. He kept his eyes locked on Jason, watching his senior associate crumble into a pathetic, trembling mess. Then Richard picked up his phone again, holding it up so the screen was visible to the room. I think everyone at this table should hear the breaking news, Richard announced, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet dining room. The Wall Street Journal just published an exclusive feature. The headline reads, "Legal tech giant Aegis acquired for $120 million. Anonymous founder revealed as 34-year-old Cassidy Davis." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Richard read the sub-headline, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum impact. The article continues. Richard read, his tone entirely detached and clinical. In a massive cash acquisition, the highly secretive software platform Aegis has been officially purchased by one of the nation's leading corporate law firms. The visionary architect behind the platform, Cassidy Davis, has stepped out of the shadows, securing a 9-figure payout and a permanent seat on the acquiring firm's executive advisory board. Richard set the phone down. He looked at my parents. He looked at Jason. And then he looked at me. "It appears," Richard said smoothly, a dark, dangerous smile touching the corners of his mouth, "that we have a billionaire sitting at our table. And ironically, she is the only person here who was asked to park my car." My mother dropped her crystal wine glass. It hit the mahogany table and tipped over, spilling a dark pool of expensive red wine across the pristine white linen tablecloth. She did not even notice. She just sat there, her mouth hanging open, her eyes darting frantically between me and the glowing screen of Richard's phone. My father was completely paralyzed. His brain simply refused to process the sentence Richard had just spoken. He looked at Jason silently begging his golden child to explain the joke, to tell them that this was a mistake, a misprint, a terrible misunderstanding. But Jason had nothing left to say. The foundation of his entire existence, his intellectual superiority, his corporate dominance, his status as the undisputed pride of the family, had just been completely vaporized in less than 30 seconds. Jason stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of pure horror and absolute denial. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned completely white, desperately preparing to launch the final pathetic defense of his shattered ego. The heavy silence in the dining room was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a physical weight pressing down on every single person at the table. The words Richard Harrington had just read aloud from his screen continued to echo off the walls, refusing to dissipate. $120 million. Legal tech giant. Cassidy Davis. The reality of those phrases violently collided with the narrative my family had spent the last 5 years aggressively enforcing. My father, Thomas, could not accept the information secondhand. He had to see it with his own eyes. His hands were shaking so severely that he fumbled with his smartphone twice before finally unlocking the screen. He tapped the notification banner bringing up the Wall Street Journal article. The bright white light of the screen cast a harsh, unforgiving glow across his pale features. His lips moved silently as he read the headline to himself, tracing the letters with his eyes, as if trying to find the hidden typo that would prove this was all a massive mistake. "There is a photograph," my father whispered, his voice completely hollow and devoid of its usual booming authority. His eyes darted up from the screen to look at me, then immediately snapped back down to the digital article. "It is a photograph of you, Cassidy. They have a picture of you stepping out of a black car in front of the federal courthouse in New York last month. The caption says you are the sole founder and chief executive officer of Aegis." My mother Brenda was still staring blankly at the dark pool of expensive red wine she had just spilled across her pristine tablecloth. She slowly raised her head, looking at my father with an expression of profound, unadulterated confusion. "Thomas? That is simply not possible," my mother said, her voice trembling as she desperately clung to her shattered reality. "She builds little websites for bakeries. She dropped out of law school because the reading was too hard. She could not possibly be running a corporate technology firm. There must be another Cassidy Davis. It is a common name, Thomas. They have made a terrible journalistic error. They have used the wrong photograph." But she knew it was not an error. Deep down, the sheer magnitude of the truth was already settling into her bones. She looked at the heavy matte black American Express Centurion card still resting innocently next to my plate. She looked at Richard Harrington, the managing partner of an elite law firm, who was currently staring at me with a level of absolute reverence he had never once shown to her golden son. The cognitive dissonance was actively tearing her mind apart. Natalie reached into her purse and pulled out her own phone. She opened her internet browser and typed my name into the search bar. A second later, a soft, genuine gasp escaped her lips. She covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with shock and pure amazement. "Oh my God! Cass." Natalie breathed out, tears instantly pooling in her eyes. "You are on the front page of Forbes right now. The article says you single-handedly revolutionized the corporate compliance industry. It says you built the core algorithm from a studio apartment while living completely under the radar for 5 years." DeAndre leaned over his wife's shoulder to look at the glowing screen. A massive, booming laugh erupted from his chest, breaking the stifling tension in the room. It was not a nervous laugh. It was a laugh of pure, vindicated triumph. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and looked at me with an expression of boundless respect. "Well, I guess that fully explains how you managed to buy a historic 4-bedroom home in Evanston with straight cash," DeAndre said, shaking his head in absolute awe. He then turned his gaze directly toward my brother, his smile transforming into a sharp, unforgiving smirk. And to think Jason was just generous enough to offer to cover your $150 share of the Wagyu beef because he knew things were tight for a dropout. That was incredibly charitable of you, Jason. Really top-tier brotherly behavior. Jason did not respond to DeAndre. He could not respond. He was physically incapable of forming a coherent sentence. He just sat there gripping the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles bone-white, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man who had just been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute, watching the ground rush up to meet him at terrifying speed. He stared at his phone, reading the details of the acquisition over and over again. Richard Harrington was also reading the full article, his sharp legal mind quickly processing the vast implications of the news. He scrolled down the page, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. The article details the technical architecture of the Aegis platform. Richard noted his deep voice commanding the attention of the entire room once again. It specifically highlights the brilliant implementation of a localized shadow server environment designed to quarantine state-specific data privacy regulations without requiring a physical hardware split. The financial analysts are calling it an elegant billion-dollar solution to a problem that has plagued the legal industry for a decade. Richard slowly lowered his phone and turned his head to look directly at Jason. The managing partner's eyes were cold and merciless. And just 10 minutes ago, Jason Richard continued, his tone dangerously soft. You sat at this very table and told me that the system utilized a blockchain firewall. You told me it routed information through a closed-circuit cloud network. You used meaningless buzzwords to mask the fact that you have absolutely no idea how this technology functions. You were put in charge of the legal framework for a $120 million acquisition, and you lied directly to my face about your comprehension of the core product. Jason swallowed hard. A thick bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face. Richard, please. He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. I can explain the methodology. I just need to review my notes. You do not have any notes that can explain away sheer incompetence, Jason. Richard interrupted sharply, completely shutting him down. You then proceeded to mock the actual founder of the company, telling her she did not understand the technology she personally invented. You called her a compulsive liar. You apologized to me for her presence at this table. The sheer gravity of the situation finally crushed the last remaining breath of air out of the dining room. The absolute horror of what my family had done and who they had done it to was fully exposed under the bright chandelier. They had spent the entire evening and the 5 years prior ruthlessly bullying the one person who now held the power to destroy their golden child's entire career with a single phone call. One by one, the mechanical ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to synchronize with their rapidly beating hearts. Slowly, almost magnetically, every single pair of eyes in the room shifted away from the glowing screens of their smartphones. My father looked up from the Wall Street Journal. My mother looked away from the spilled wine. Natalie and DeAndre looked across the table. Jason slowly dragged his horrified gaze upward. And Richard Harrington sat perfectly still, watching the culmination of this extraordinary moment. They all looked directly at me. I sat at the far end of the table, exactly where they had banished me. I did not gloat. I did not smile triumphantly, or launch into a bitter speech about how wrong they had been. I did not need to raise my voice to demand their respect anymore. My sheer existence, completely unfiltered and finally brought into the light, was the only statement I needed to make. I reached forward, my movements perfectly calm and entirely unhurried. My fingers wrapped around the delicate stem of my crystal glass. I lifted it to my lips, maintaining absolute unwavering eye contact with my brother, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. I lowered the crystal glass back to the table, the dark red liquid settling perfectly level. The taste of the cheap Pinot Noir was suddenly the most exquisite vintage I had ever consumed. Jason broke the silence first. The sound that came out of his throat was a dry, scraping noise, like a rusted gear trying to force itself into motion. He frantically shook his head, his perfectly styled hair falling out of place, the arrogant veneer completely shattering under the weight of his own panic. This is a typo, Jason stammered, his voice cracking violently in the middle of the sentence. It has to be a typo. Or a clickbait scam. Hackers. Somebody hacked the financial feeds. He looked wildly around the room, desperately seeking validation from anyone who would give it to him. His eyes darted from Richard to our parents to me and back to the glowing screen of his phone. The heavy slab of Wagyu beef sitting on his plate was rapidly cooling, completely forgotten. Look at the screen, Jason pleaded, tapping the glass of his smartphone so hard I thought the screen might actually shatter under his finger. It is an algorithmic error. Those financial news aggregate sites pull data automatically from unreliable sources all the time. Somebody probably bought a fake press release to manipulate the stock market, and they randomly pulled her name from a public municipal database. Cassidy does not even know how to code. She took one introductory computer science class her freshman year of college and barely passed. She builds basic email templates for local shops. She does not build multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence platforms. My mother Brenda immediately latched onto Jason's frantic explanation like a drowning woman grabbing a life preserver in a hurricane. She let out a high-pitched, breathy laugh that sounded completely unhinged, her hands fluttering nervously around her spilled wine. "Oh, thank goodness," my mother gasped, pressing her manicured hands to her cheeks. For a second there, I thought the world had completely turned upside down. A computer glitch. Of course it is just a computer glitch. You almost gave me a heart attack, Cassidy. She looked at me. Her face stretched into a rigid, terrifying smile. She was actively waiting for the punchline. She was waiting for me to laugh, to apologize for the scare, to admit that it was all a ridiculous misunderstanding so we could go back to praising Jason. You really should call whoever hosts your little website and tell them their marketing team went way too far, my mother scolded playfully, though her eyes were wide with sheer unadulterated panic. Pretending you sold a company for $120 million is a very dangerous prank to play. The federal government could investigate you for things like that. You need to be much more careful with your internet projects before you get yourself into real legal trouble. But my father, Thomas, was not laughing. The embarrassment of the situation was rapidly morphing into intense, burning anger. He felt foolish for having been caught off guard by the notification, and in his world, feeling foolish was an unforgivable offense that required immediate punishment. He slammed both of his heavy hands flat against the mahogany table, glaring at me with absolute fury. "Explain this sick prank right now, Cassidy," my father demanded, his voice booming with the absolute authority he used to terrify us when we were children. "How did you manage to spoof the Wall Street Journal application on Richard Harrington's phone? Did you hire someone to do this? Did you pay a malicious hacker to disrupt this dinner just to embarrass your brother in front of his managing partner?" The sheer absurdity of my father's accusation hung heavily in the air. He genuinely believed that I had orchestrated a massive synchronized cyber attack on the most prestigious financial news networks on the planet, coordinating it perfectly with the Thanksgiving dinner schedule, all just to ruin Jason's evening. He would rather believe I was an international cyber criminal than admit I was a successful entrepreneur. DeAndre let out another massive booming laugh, shaking his head in total disbelief. "Thomas, do you hear yourself right now?" DeAndre asked, resting his elbows firmly on the table and leaning forward. "You are literally accusing your own daughter of committing a highly sophisticated federal cybercrime just so you do not have to admit that she is smarter than Jason. It is over, Thomas. The denial is just embarrassing at this point. Look at the photograph on the screen. Unless Cassidy hired a Hollywood special effects team to digitally insert her face onto the body of a billionaire, that is your daughter standing proudly outside the federal courthouse. He is lying," Jason shouted, his panic rapidly escalating into full-blown hysteria. He pointed a shaking finger at DeAndre, then swung his arm aggressively toward me. "She is lying. She probably changed her legal name to match the real founder. Or she bought a fake ID to take those photos. I do not know exactly how she did it, but it is a massive lie. Richard, you cannot possibly believe this nonsense. You know her. You see how she lives. She was just sitting here letting us buy her dinner. Real billionaires do not let their brothers pay for a $150 cut of meat out of pity. I sat perfectly still in my chair, letting the chaotic waves of their denial crash completely over me. I did not feel the need to argue. I did not feel the need to pull out my bank statements or open my secure email to show them the signed acquisition contracts. Their refusal to accept reality was not my problem anymore. It was simply the final pathetic death rattle of their absolute control over my life. For 5 long years, I had allowed them to dictate my worth. I had allowed them to introduce me to every family friend as the ultimate failure. I had swallowed their sharp insults, endured their suffocating pity, and literally parked their cars. I had done it all in total silence because I knew this exact moment was coming. I knew that the ultimate revenge would not be a screaming match in the middle of the dining room. The ultimate revenge would be total, undeniable, unarguable victory broadcasted to the entire world. And as I looked at Jason's red, sweating face, and my father's furious, bulging eyes, and my mother's desperate, terrified smile, I knew that I had achieved exactly what I set out to do. I had completely destroyed the illusion of their superiority, and they were burying themselves in the rubble. Jason was still rambling, his voice growing increasingly hoarse as he desperately tried to convince Richard that I was a fraud. He was quoting random legal statutes that did not apply, threatening to personally sue the publications for defamation, promising to have his firm launch a full-scale investigation into the false reporting. He was systematically destroying whatever tiny shred of professional dignity he had left in front of the man who controlled his paycheck. Natalie watched her brother with a mixture of profound pity and second-hand embarrassment. She slowly slid her own phone across the white linen tablecloth toward Jason. The screen was displaying my official biography on the Aegis corporate website, complete with a detailed history of my legal education at Columbia and my subsequent pivot into algorithmic compliance architecture. Jason just read it, Natalie said softly, her voice filled with quiet sadness. It is real. Cassidy is the founder. She has been doing this the whole time while we were making fun of her. Jason snatched the phone from the table, his eyes scanning the text so fast, I thought he might make himself dizzy. He shook his head violently, refusing to process the words on the screen. He threw the phone back onto the table, treating it like a poisonous snake that had just bitten him. No, Jason hissed, his breathing shallow and incredibly erratic. No, it is a scam. It is a highly coordinated scam, and I am going to prove it right now. I decided that the show had gone on long enough. The entertainment value of their denial was rapidly wearing off, replaced by a deep, overwhelming exhaustion. I was entirely tired of listening to my brother beg the universe to change his reality. I was tired of watching my parents twist themselves into psychological knots to protect him from the truth. I was ready to end this charade once and for all. I took one final slow sip of the cheap red wine. Then I lowered the crystal glass to the white linen tablecloth. The soft clink of the glass against the wood beneath the fabric seemed to echo loudly, cutting sharply through Jason's frantic, pathetic rambling. I did not look at my brother. I did not look at my father or my mother. I completely ignored the 3 people who had spent my entire life actively trying to make me feel small and insignificant. Instead, I turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto Richard Harrington, the managing partner of the elite law firm, the man who held Jason's entire future in his hands, the only person in the room who actually understood the immense magnitude of what had just happened. Richard was waiting for me. He had not engaged with Jason's hysteria or my father's ridiculous anger. He was simply sitting back in his chair, watching the architect of his firm's future gracefully navigate the absolute chaos of her toxic family. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, sitting up perfectly straight. I cleared my throat, a soft professional sound that instantly commanded the attention of the entire room. The frantic arguing died completely away. Jason froze mid-sentence. My parents held their breath. I looked at the most powerful man in the room, offering him a polite, entirely businesslike smile, and prepared to deliver the final, devastating blow to my brother's career. I believe your firm's wire transfer hit my holding account at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon. Richard, I said, my voice perfectly steady and crystal clear. The funds have been fully authenticated and cleared by my broker. The acquisition is complete, and that highly complex integration protocol that Jason here has been butchering for the last hour. I paused, allowing my eyes to briefly flick toward my terrified brother before locking back onto the managing partner. I wrote the core architecture for that algorithm in my pajamas, sitting on the floor of a studio apartment. The words did not echo. They simply dropped onto the dining table like heavy anvils, crushing whatever microscopic fragments of denial my family had left. Richard Harrington did not blink. He did not ask me to provide further proof. He did not ask to see my bank statements or my corporate registration documents. He was a man whose entire career was built on evaluating human behavior and identifying the truth in high-stakes negotiations. He looked at my unwavering posture. He looked at the deep, calm certainty in my eyes. And then he looked at the identical matte black titanium Centurion card resting on the white linen next to my plate. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place, and the lock clicked open in Richard's mind. The realization hit him with the physical force of a freight train. The woman sitting across from him was not a pathetic dropout. She was not a compulsive liar who built email templates for local bakeries. She was the absolute genius who had just single-handedly revolutionized the corporate compliance industry. She was the anonymous architect behind the most significant technological leap his firm had ever taken. She was the newly minted 9-figure tech titan that his partners had spent the last 3 months desperately trying to court. And his senior associate had just spent the entire evening treating her like absolute garbage. A profound, sickening wave of realization washed over Richard's face as his mind rapidly rewound through the events of the evening. He remembered standing in the grand marble foyer when we first arrived. He remembered my father introducing me as a failure who could not handle the academic rigor of law school. He remembered my mother forcing me to hand over a bottle of expensive wine like I was a delivery driver. He remembered Jason throwing his car keys directly at my chest. "You made her park my car," Richard whispered. His voice was barely audible, but in the dead silence of the dining room it sounded like a gunshot. He slowly turned his head to look at Jason. The expression on Richard's face was no longer just professional disappointment. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at Jason as if my brother were a cockroach that had just crawled onto his plate. "You threw your keys at the founder of Aegis and told her not to scratch the rims." Richard stated, his voice growing louder, trembling with a mixture of sheer disbelief and mounting rage. "You sat at this table and told a woman who just secured a $120 million buyout that she runs a glorified customer service app. You laughed in her face and offered to buy her dinner out of pity." Jason opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, high-pitched squeak came out. He was physically shrinking into his expensive tailored suit. His shoulders were hunched, his hands were trembling uncontrollably in his lap, and his face was the color of wet ash. "Richard." I did not know. Jason choked out, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "I swear to you I had no idea. She never told us. She kept it a secret. It is not my fault. You did not need to know her net worth to treat her like a human being." "Jason." Richard snapped, his voice cracking like a whip across the table. "You did not need to know she was a billionaire to show your own sister a basic level of respect, but your absolute lack of character is not even the most concerning issue here. The issue is your staggering, breathtaking professional incompetence." Richard stood up from his chair. The sudden movement caused my parents to physically jump in their seats. The managing partner towered over the dining table, radiating absolute authority. "You sat here and lied to my face," Richard said, pointing a rigid finger down at Jason. "You claimed you were engineering the legal parameters for the integration. You used my presence at this table to boast about your comprehension of a system you clearly do not understand at all. And when the actual creator of the software asked you a legitimate, highly specific question about the data purge protocols, you tried to cover up your ignorance by mocking her intelligence. You called her a fraud to protect your own ego. Jason was completely paralyzed. He could not look at his boss. He stared down at his plate, tears of sheer panic welling up in his eyes. And do you want to know the absolute worst part of this entire magnificent display of stupidity? Jason Richard asked, his voice dropping into a dark, lethal register. Do you want to know exactly how badly you have miscalculated your position tonight? Richard slowly turned his gaze away from Jason and looked out across the table. He looked at my father, who was sitting with his mouth hanging open. He looked at my mother, who was trembling so violently, her pearl necklace rattled against her collarbone. And then he looked at me, offering a deep, respectful nod of his head. As part of the final acquisition agreement that was signed 48 hours ago, Richard announced to the dead silent room, the founder of Aegis required a specific structural concession. In exchange for the final handover of the source code, my firm agreed to grant Miss Davis a permanent voting seat on our executive advisory board. The power dynamic of the entire family shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a single second. My father let out a sharp, ragged gasp, clutching his chest as if he had just been physically struck. My mother covered her face with both of her hands, letting out a muffled sob of pure horror. Natalie stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, completely mesmerized by the sheer scale of the reversal. DeAndre just sat back and smiled, looking at Jason with an expression of absolute, merciless satisfaction. Jason slowly lifted his head. His eyes met mine across the long mahogany table. The realization hit him with a devastating, inescapable finality. I was not just wealthy. I was not just successful. I was now actively sitting on the executive board of his law firm. I was one of the senior stakeholders who dictated the future of his company. I was the person who would evaluate the partner tracks, approve the departmental budgets, and oversee the strategic direction of the very firm he had dedicated his entire pathetic life to climbing. I was, for all intents and purposes, his boss. Jason, I said quietly, my voice slicing through the heavy air with surgical precision. I told you that the algorithm was not a fast librarian. I told you that the data compliance modules required a localized shadow server. I tried to engage you in a high-level discussion about the technology you claimed to be mastering, but you were so desperately committed to treating me like a failure that you chose to humiliate yourself instead. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the white linen tablecloth. I looked directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. You wanted to prove to Richard that you were the smartest person in the room? I continued, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. But all you did was prove that you are a liability. You proved that you are willing to lie about your technical comprehension to secure a promotion. You proved that you will aggressively belittle the people around you to mask your own insecurities. And you proved it all directly in front of the managing partner of your firm and the newest member of your executive board. The silence that followed my words was absolute. It was the silence of a kingdom completely collapsing into dust. The golden child had been entirely stripped of his armor, his title, and his future. He sat there utterly defeated, entirely exposed, with absolutely nowhere left to hide. My father, finally realizing that the ground had completely given way beneath them, desperately tried to intervene. He frantically cleared his throat, his face flushing a deep, chaotic shade of red, and prepared to attempt the most spectacular, pathetic backpedal of his entire life. Thomas cleared his throat. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet dining room, like a desperate plea for normalcy. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, his face a frantic map of rapid recalculation. The deep purple flush of anger that had just consumed his features instantly vanished, replaced by a wide, completely unnatural smile that stretched tight across his face. Well, Thomas started, his voice adopting a jovial, entirely fake warmth that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I have to say, Cassidy, you certainly know how to keep your old man on his toes. What an incredible surprise. Truly, A $120 million acquisition. He let out a breathless, forced chuckle, looking around the table as if expecting us to all join in on the joke. I mean, we always knew you were quietly working on something spectacular. We just did not want to pry into your business. You always were the independent one. I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his pivot was staggering. 10 minutes ago he was threatening to kick me out of his dining room for looking at my phone. Now he was actively trying to take credit for my discretion. My mother immediately picked up on his cue. The harsh, panicked lines on her face melted into a mask of overwhelming, sickeningly sweet maternal pride. She reached across the pristine white linen tablecloth, attempting to place her trembling hand over mine. I calmly slid my hand away, leaving her manicured fingers grasping at empty air. She quickly pulled her hand back, feigning a small, wounded smile. "We always pushed you because we knew you had so much potential." "Honey?" Brenda stammered, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. "We were hard on you, yes, we admit that. But it was only because we wanted to prepare you for the ruthless corporate world. We saw your brilliance even when you thought we were just being critical." It was tough love, Cassidy. Every parent wants their child to succeed, and look at you now. Our tough love clearly worked. We shaped you into a titan. The absolute delusion in her voice was almost mesmerizing. They were actively trying to rewrite half a decade of relentless psychological abuse into a masterclass on parenting. They wanted Richard Harrington to believe that they were the architects of my success, rather than the primary obstacles I had to overcome to achieve it. They were trying to package their cruelty as a gift. I looked at my mother, then at my father. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream or pound my fists on the table to dismantle their pathetic facade. I simply let the silence stretch for a long moment, ensuring that every single word I was about to say would land with maximum devastating impact. "Do not dare call it tough love," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register that instantly wiped the fake smiles off their faces. "And do not ever try to take credit for my survival." My mother shrank back in her chair, her eyes darting nervously toward Richard. "Cassidy, please," she whispered urgently, dropping the sweet facade for a fraction of a second. "We have a guest. Let us not air dirty laundry tonight." "Your guest already knows exactly who you are, Mom," I replied smoothly, refusing to break eye contact with her. "He watched you do it." Less than an hour ago, Dad introduced me to Richard as a failure who could not handle the academic rigor of law school. You told me I was wearing clothes meant for a pathetic part-time gig. You publicly humiliated me over a bottle of wine and banished it to the kitchen because Jason brought the Camus. You both sat there and laughed while Jason treated me like a valet. And when I offered to pay for your dinner, you accused me of financial fraud. When the truth literally rang on your phones, you tried to convince Richard that I was a psychiatric patient in need of an intervention. We were just shocked, my father interrupted weakly, his face turning a deep shade of crimson again. "We were caught off guard, Cassidy. You kept this from us for 5 years. What did you expect us to think?" "I kept it from you because I knew exactly who you were." I fired back, my words precise and unforgiving. "I knew that the second I walked away from a traditional path, you would stop seeing me as your daughter and start seeing me as an embarrassment to your country club reputation. Family is supposed to be a safe harbor. But in this house, affection is conditional. Love is entirely dependent on what you can put on a corporate resume." I leaned forward, making sure my father heard every single syllable. "You did not push me to succeed. You actively rooted for me to fail so you could feel justified in your obvious favoritism for Jason. You spent 5 years treating me like a stray dog that you begrudgingly allowed into your house for the holidays. You did not build my resilience. I spent thousands of hours alone in a freezing apartment building my company from nothing, entirely without a safety net, because I knew my own parents would let me drown. My resilience was built entirely in spite of you." The truth stripped away every single layer of their defense. My mother let out a small, genuine sob, pressing her linen napkin to her mouth. But she was not crying out of remorse for the pain she had caused me. She was crying out of profound self-pity. She realized that the narrative she relied on for her social standing was completely destroyed, and the daughter she had treated like garbage was now completely untouchable. My father opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He looked down at his plate, entirely defeated by the undeniable reality of his own actions. He had worshipped the altar of wealth and status his entire life, and now the ultimate deity of that religion was sitting at the end of his table, entirely out of his reach and thoroughly disgusted by him. DeAndre gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval from beside me. Natalie was quietly wiping a tear from her cheek, a mixture of sorrow for our broken family and deep, silent pride in my strength. The dining room fell into a heavy, oppressive stillness. My parents had completely failed to re-establish their dominance, and they had failed to smooth things over in front of the managing partner of Jason's law firm. Their desperation had only highlighted their toxicity. Jason, who had been sitting in paralyzed terror for the last several minutes, suddenly realized that the ship was rapidly sinking, and his parents had just completely failed to patch the hole. He looked at Richard, seeing the profound, unyielding disgust radiating from his boss. Jason knew that if he remained tied to my parents' sinking reputation, his career was absolutely over. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in, overpowering any remaining shred of family loyalty he possessed. Jason sat up straight, his eyes frantically darting around the table, preparing to throw the very parents who had worshipped him his entire life directly under the bus to save his own skin. Jason violently pushed his chair back, distancing himself from my parents as if their sudden loss of status were a highly contagious disease. He turned toward Richard Harrington, his face slick with sweat, and attempted the most cowardly, desperate maneuver I had ever witnessed. "Richard, you have to understand the environment I grew up in." Jason pleaded, his voice cracking as he actively threw the people who had worshipped him his entire life directly under the bus. My parents have always been incredibly toxic toward Cassidy. They constantly belittled her. I was just trying to keep the peace at the table tonight. I was playing along so my father would not cause a scene. My mother gasped, pressing both hands over her mouth in absolute shock. "Jason, how could you say that?" She whimpered, her heart completely breaking, as her golden child publicly disowned her to save his paycheck. "We gave you everything." Jason ignored her entirely. He leaned across the table toward me, forcing a wide, frantic smile that looked more like a grimace of pure agony. "Cass." Jason said, his voice dripping with a sudden, sickeningly sweet affection. "I am so incredibly proud of you. I really am. I always knew you were a genius. Even when you dropped out of Columbia, I told Dad that you were destined for bigger things. I was just keeping up appearances tonight. You know how they are. But the Aegis platform, it is brilliant. And knowing that my own sister built it well, it is the honor of my life to help integrate your software into the firm. We are going to make an incredible team on the executive board." I stared at him, feeling a wave of absolute pure nausea roll through my stomach. Jason was not just arrogant. He was entirely devoid of a spine. The moment his superiority was threatened, he was willing to sacrifice his own parents and beg for mercy from the sister he had spent 5 years treating like dirt. He honestly believed he could charm his way out of a $120 million lie by playing the role of the proud, supportive older brother. Richard Harrington did not share Jason's delusional optimism. The managing partner of the elite law firm let out a slow, heavy sigh that sounded like a judge preparing to deliver a life sentence. "Do not insult my intelligence, Jason," Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that instantly silenced my brother's frantic pleading. "And do not dare insult your sister by pretending you had any part in her success. Your lack of loyalty to your own family is repulsive, but your professional conduct tonight is entirely unforgivable." Jason froze, his frantic smile collapsing. "Richard, please," he whispered. "I am a top biller. I bring in millions for the firm." "You brought in millions because we handed you legacy clients," Richard corrected sharply, his eyes narrowing into cold, unforgiving slits. But this firm operates on absolute trust. Our clients trust us with their most sensitive corporate secrets because they believe we possess the highest level of integrity and competence. You sat at this table and actively lied to my face about the core mechanics of a nine-figure acquisition. You fabricated technical jargon to mask your complete ignorance. Richard placed his hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning forward to ensure Jason felt the full crushing weight of his authority. If you are willing to lie to your managing partner at a holiday dinner just to stroke your own ego, Richard continued his words, striking Jason like physical blows, I cannot possibly trust you to handle the complex legal framework of our corporate clients. If I let you finalize the Aegis integration, you would likely expose the firm to massive liability simply because you are too arrogant to admit when you do not understand a technical parameter. I understand it now. Jason begged, tears literally spilling over his lower eyelids and tracking down his flushed cheeks. Cassidy can explain it to me. I will work all weekend. I will learn the entire architecture. Please, Richard, I am up for junior partner next week. My entire life is at this firm. You were up for junior partner next week. Richard corrected, his tone completely devoid of any sympathy. As of this exact moment, your partner track is under immediate and indefinite review. Furthermore, I am removing you from the Aegis acquisition team entirely. You are a liability to this firm and a liability to this integration. Jason let out a hollow, devastated sob. He buried his face in his hands, completely crumbling under the sheer magnitude of his absolute ruin. Do not bother coming into the office on Monday, Jason Richards stated coldly, delivering the final fatal strike to my brother's career. I suggest you take an unpaid leave of absence to seriously evaluate your professional ethics and your personal character. We will contact you when the board has made a final decision regarding your future with the firm, assuming, of course, that our newest board member does not recommend your immediate termination. Richard glanced briefly at me, a silent acknowledgement of the absolute power I now held over the man who had tormented me my entire life. I did not smile. I did not nod. I simply watched Jason collapse into himself, weeping into his hands like a broken child. The golden boy had completely melted down, his entire identity, his immense ego, and his guaranteed future entirely vaporized in the span of 20 minutes. The dining room was silent except for the pathetic sound of Jason's ragged breathing. My parents sat completely paralyzed, entirely unable to comfort the son who had just publicly betrayed them, and entirely too terrified to speak to the daughter they had just lost forever. They had built their entire universe around Jason's success, and now they were forced to sit in the ruins of his spectacular failure. I looked at the heavy, untouched slab of expensive Wagyu beef sitting on Jason's plate. I looked at the dark red wine stain bleeding across my mother's perfect white tablecloth. I looked at the heavy, matte black American Express card resting quietly next to my water glass. The show was officially over. There was absolutely nothing left for me to do here. The scales of justice had been violently rebalanced, and the toxic atmosphere of this house no longer held any power over me. I calmly reached forward and picked up my titanium Centurion card, sliding it smoothly back into my leather wallet. I pushed my heavy mahogany chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, the sound cutting sharply through the suffocating tension in the room. I stood up. I did not rush. I smoothed down the front of my tailored blazer, maintaining the exact same calm, professional demeanor I had held since the moment I walked through the front door. I did not scream. I did not throw a glass of wine or launch into a dramatic emotional monologue. My ultimate revenge was my complete, chilling apathy toward the people who had tried to destroy me. My father, Thomas, realizing that I was actually leaving, felt a sudden, desperate need to reclaim a tiny fraction of his shattered authority. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He slammed his fist down onto the table, the silverware rattling violently against the china plates. "You sit back down right now, Cassidy," my father demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and absolute panic. "We are not finished here. You do not get to drop a bomb like this on your family and just walk away. We are going to sit here and discuss this like adults. You are going to act like a part of this family. I stopped. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the man who had spent the last 5 years calling me a massive disappointment. I looked right through him, stripping away his title of father and seeing him exactly for what he was, a sad, shallow man who only valued the things he could brag about at a country club. I did not drop out of law school because the academics were too hard, Dad. I said, my voice perfectly level and entirely empty of affection. I dropped out because the traditional path was moving entirely too slow for me. And I am walking away right now because I have absolutely no interest in discussing my future with people who actively prayed for my failure. I looked down at the table one last time, my eyes sweeping over my weeping brother and my terrified mother. Enjoy the wagyu, I said softly. I turned my back on my family and walked out of the dining room. My footsteps echoed steadily against the hardwood floors of the grand foyer. I did not look back at the family portraits on the wall. I reached the front closet, retrieved my winter coat, and pulled open the heavy oak front door. The crisp, freezing November air rushed in, filling my lungs with the sharp, clean taste of absolute freedom. I stepped out onto the front porch, the freezing wind whipping my hair across my face. I pulled my coat tight around my shoulders, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settle deep into my bones. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 34 years was completely gone. As I walked down the brick pathway toward the street, reaching into my pocket for my car keys, I heard the heavy oak door open and close behind me. I stopped and turned around. Standing on the porch, pulling their coats tight against the winter chill, were Natalie and DeAndre. DeAndre had his arm wrapped protectively around my younger sister's shoulders. They walked down the stairs, their breath pluming in the freezing air, leaving the toxic fortress of my parents' home entirely behind them. DeAndre looked at me, a massive, brilliant smile breaking across his face. We figured the dinner party was pretty much over, DeAndre said, his deep voice carrying easily over the winter wind. And honestly, Cass, we would rather eat drive-through burgers with a tech titan than sit in that dining room for another second. Natalie stepped forward, her eyes still red from crying, but a genuine hopeful smile touched her lips. She reached out and grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. I am so incredibly proud of you, Cass, she whispered. I always was. I looked at my sister and then at my brother-in-law. The family I was born into was currently sitting inside that massive empty house, drowning in their own ruined egos. But the family I actually chose, the people who respected me when they thought I had absolutely nothing, were standing right here with me in the cold. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to my eyes. Let us go get some burgers, I said. I unlocked my car, and the three of us drove away into the crisp autumn night, leaving the golden child and his broken empire entirely in the rearview mirror. The leather seats of my car were freezing when we first climbed inside, but as the engine roared to life and the heater kicked into high gear, a profound and comforting warmth began to spread through the cabin. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled out of my parents' expansive circular driveway. I did not look back at the sprawling brick colonial house in the rearview mirror. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the dark, tree-lined street ahead of us, watching the sweeping beams of my headlights cut through the crisp November night. DeAndre leaned forward from the back seat, resting his arms on the center console. He let out a long, rich laugh that filled the quiet space of the car. You should have seen the dining room the exact second you walked out the front door, DeAndre said, his voice vibrating with pure satisfaction. It was absolute poetry. Richard Harrington did not even say a single word to your father. He just stood up, threw his linen napkin directly onto the puddle of spilled wine your mother made, and walked straight out the back door toward the patio to call his private driver. Thomas actually tried to follow him. He was practically begging Richard to stay and have dessert, but Richard just held up one hand, stopped your dad dead in his tracks, and told him to never contact him outside of business hours again. Natalie let out a deep, trembling exhale from the passenger side of the back seat. I looked at her in the rearview mirror. The heavy tension that she had carried in her shoulders for her entire life seemed to have completely vanished. I honestly thought Mom was going to faint. Natalie added, her voice quiet but incredibly clear. She just sat there staring at the front door. And Jason was still crying. He was actually sobbing over his plate. I have spent my entire life being absolutely terrified of making them angry. I spent 32 years doing whatever they wanted because I was so scared of ending up like you. The family outcast, the disappointment. But watching you sit there tonight, watching you completely destroy their entire fake reality without even raising your voice, I realized that you were the only one who was actually free. I smiled, keeping my eyes on the road. You are free now too, Nat, I told her softly. You never have to go back to that house if you do not want to. You do not owe them your misery just because they gave you a last name. We drove for another 10 minutes, leaving the affluent, suffocating neighborhoods of the suburbs behind us. We eventually pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of a 24-hour late-night diner. It was a modest, slightly run-down building, with neon signs buzzing in the windows, the complete opposite of the luxurious five-star aesthetic my parents demanded for every meal. It was absolutely perfect. I put the car in park and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet in the cabin was peaceful. Before we stepped out into the cold air to go inside, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I had ignored the device since the breaking news alerts went off at the dining table. I unlocked the screen and opened my secure encrypted banking application. The loading icon spun for a brief, agonizing second, and then the home screen populated. I stared at the glowing numbers. I had known the exact mathematical figure of the acquisition for weeks. I had signed the contracts, reviewed the legal parameters, and authorized the transfer. But knowing the number in theory, and physically seeing it sitting as a cleared cash balance in my personal holding account were two completely different realities. There were so many zeros that my brain struggled to process the visual information. $120 million. Minus the broker fees and the federal capital gains taxes, the final net deposit was still a figure so astronomically high that it felt entirely surreal. I held the phone up, turning the screen so Natalie and DeAndre could see it from the back seat. DeAndre let out a low, impressed whistle. Natalie covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and pure joy. She reached forward and squeezed my shoulder. You really did it, Cass, Natalie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You actually did it. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. I did it, I agreed. Now let us go buy the most expensive greasy cheeseburgers this place has to offer. My treat. And do not worry, I will not make you Venmo me for the delivery fee. DeAndre laughed again, and the three of us stepped out into the freezing autumn night, walking toward the warm glow of the diner entrance. As I sat in that cracked vinyl booth a few minutes later, eating a standard diner burger and drinking cheap black coffee, surrounded by the two people who actually loved me, I realized that I had never felt wealthier. And it had absolutely nothing to do with the 9-figure bank account sitting on my phone. The greatest revelation of my entire journey was not the financial success. It was the profound, undeniable truth that family is not defined by biology. Blood does not automatically entitle anyone to your respect, your time, or your presence. Blood simply dictates the circumstances of your birth. True family is defined by the people who choose to respect you when they think you have absolutely nothing to offer them. DeAndre and Natalie had defended me when I was just a struggling dropout who parked cars and wore sensible clothes. They saw my value when my bank account was completely empty. They offered me warmth in a house that was built entirely out of ice. That is what a real family does. My parents and Jason did not want a daughter or a sister. They wanted a prop. They wanted a mirror that reflected their own manufactured greatness back at them. When they thought I lacked power, they aggressively discarded me. And when they finally realized I possessed more power than they could ever dream of, their first instinct was to manipulate it for their own gain. but I had finally walked away from their table. I had starved them of the only thing they truly cared about, which was control. The golden child was left to face the devastating consequences of his own arrogance, and the toxic parents were left to sit in a massive empty house with no one left to perform for. I am Cassidy, 34 years old. And tonight I did not just sell a technology company, I permanently bought my freedom. If you have ever had to walk away from a table where respect was no longer being served, I want you to know that the guilt you feel at first is entirely normal, but the peace that follows is absolutely permanent. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own mental health and your own future? How did you finally find the courage to walk out the door? I would deeply love to hear your stories of survival and independence in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to hear more authentic stories about resilience, boundaries, and growth. And if you know someone who might need a reminder today that their worth is not defined by the family members who refuse to see it, please share this video with them. Thank you for being a part of my story. And please always remember, the family you actively choose to build around yourself will always be infinitely stronger than the one you were simply born into.